Welcome to Anana's creation. Today, we begin an epic journey into the distant echo of the past, to the age of myth, when gods and mortals walked the earth together, and the fate of nations rested on the strength of a single champion. This is the legend of the greatest warrior the world has ever known. His name was Achilles. His is a story of breathtaking glory, of uncontrollable rage, and of a destiny written in stone before he ever drew his first breath. We speak of a man who was the pinnacle of human strength and speed, a fighter so perfect he was said to be truly invincible. Yet he was haunted by a prophecy that guaranteed his doom, and defined by a single, fatal flaw. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but with a union that defied the laws of nature. The father of Achilles was King Marcus, a great and noble mortal ruler, respected by all. But his mother was no ordinary queen. His mother was Tethys, a powerful, shimmering goddess of the sea, an immortal nymph who knew the deep secrets of the ocean and the hidden whispers of fate. When their son, Achilles, was born, the mortal world celebrated. Here was an heir who carried the strength of a heroic king and the divine grace of the sea. But Tethys felt no joy. While the mortals celebrated, she listened to the higher powers, to the oracle that governed the destinies of both gods and men. And what she heard turned her immortal blood to ice. The prophecy was specific. The fates had woven two separate paths for her son, and he would eventually have to choose. Path 1. Achilles could live a long, peaceful, and unremarkable life. He could marry, have children, grow old, and die peacefully in his bed, surrounded by grandchildren. He would be happy, but the world would never remember his name. Path 2. He could choose the life of a warrior. If he did, he would achieve glory that mortals had never before witnessed. His name would be sung by poets for 10,000 years. He would be remembered, forever, as the greatest fighter who ever lived. But if he chose this path, he was doomed to die young, far from home, upon the battlefield. And the prophecy whispered one more name: Troy. His glorious destiny, and his certain death, were waiting for him at the gates of the great city of Troy. For a mortal, this might be a tragic choice, but a choice nonetheless. For his immortal mother, Tethys, it was unbearable. She would not lose her son to a spear. She would not allow fate to steal him. If destiny demanded he be a warrior, Tethys would defy destiny itself. She would make him a warrior who could not be harmed. She would make her mortal son invincible. Tethys fled the palace, clutching the infant Achilles. She traveled to the very edge of the mortal world, to the boundary of the living and the dead, where the underworld began. Here flowed the mythical river Styx, a dark, swirling torrent of black water. This river was the most sacred thing in existence. It was the water upon which the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths. An oath sworn on the Styx could never be broken. Legend held that the river's water possessed a unique power. Anything bathed in its current would be rendered impervious to harm. No sword, no spear, no arrow could pierce skin protected by the Styx. This was her plan. This was her desperate gamble against fate. Standing on the banks of that terrible river, surrounded by the shadows of the underworld, Tethys held her son. She had to submerge him completely. But the current was strong, and the baby was small. If she let him go, he would be swept away into the land of the dead forever. She had to hold on to him. She scanned the infant's body, looking for a place to grip him, a place secure enough to hold him against the supernatural torrent. She grasped him tightly by his small left heel. Taking a deep breath, the sea goddess plunged her son into the black, forbidden water. The magical current of the Styx washed over him. It covered his head, his chest, his arms, and his legs. The water seeped into his skin, forging it anew, making his flesh harder than iron, tougher than dragon scale. She held him under until the magic was complete, until the power of the sacred oath had infused his entire body. Then, she pulled him out. He was alive. He was perfect. And he was, she believed, safe. Tethys had done the impossible. She had created a mortal man who could not be wounded. No arrow could puncture his chest. No blade could slice his arms. She had given him a shield greater than any forged by man. But in her divine haste, in her desperate focus to save her son from the prophecy, she had forgotten one critical detail. The water had touched every inch of him, except for the tiny spot on his left heel where her own immortal fingers had gripped his flesh. That small patch of skin had been shielded by her hand. It had never touched the sacred water. While the rest of his body was divine and untouchable, his heel remained perfectly, tragically, mortally human. Achilles grew up unaware of this. All he knew was that he was special. He was stronger than the other boys. He was faster. When they played war, the wooden sticks they used as swords shattered against his skin, leaving no mark. He could outrun a speeding chariot. He could hunt lions with his bare hands. His father, King Marcus, ensured he received the greatest training possible. Achilles was taught by the legendary mentor, Chiron, a master of strategy, medicine, and every weapon known to man. But Chiron quickly realized that training Achilles was like trying to teach an eagle how to fly. Achilles did not need to be taught how to fight. He was born knowing. His movements were a blur, his reflexes supernatural. He was not just a warrior, he was war itself, made manifest in the body of a golden-haired prince. As he grew into a young man, tales of his prowess spread across the kingdoms. He was the golden boy, the unbeatable, the perfect warrior. But Tethys watched, and her heart remained heavy. She knew what she had done. She knew about the heel. And she knew that the prophecy had not gone away. It had only waited. The forces that govern the world do not like to be cheated. Fate, Tethys knew, always finds a way. She looked to the east, toward the kingdom of the High King, and she could feel the drums of war beginning to beat. A conflict was brewing. A ship was about to sail. A queen was about to be stolen. The 10-year war that the oracle spoke of, the war at Troy, was drawing near. She had made her son invincible, but she knew it wasn't enough. If he could not be killed by force, fate would defeat him by trickery. Her first plan had failed, leaving a fatal flaw. Now, she had to enact her second plan. She could not just protect her son's body, she had to hide his very existence from the world and the war that was coming to claim him. As Achilles grew into the perfect warrior, the gears of fate, which his mother Tethys had tried so desperately to stop, began to turn. Far across the sea, the event that the oracle had whispered of finally came to pass. The inciting incident, as it so often is, was a story of betrayal and stolen love. Helen, the queen of the kingdom of Sparta, said to be the most beautiful woman in the living world, abandoned her husband, King Miles. She had fled with Perry, a handsome and charismatic prince from the great Eastern Empire of Troy. King Miles was humiliated. His brother, the ambitious High King Mason, was furious. This act of treachery was an insult that could not be ignored. High King Mason put out the call, summoning the armies of every allied kingdom, activating ancient treaties and demanding retribution. He would assemble the largest fleet the world had ever seen. He would sail to Troy, burn the city to the ground, and bring Helen back. The Trojan War had begun. But as High King Mason gathered his strategists, his own oracles delivered a chilling warning. The walls of Troy, they said, were unbreakable. The city could not be taken. They would fail, unless one specific warrior fought on their side. They needed the Golden Prince, the son of Tethys. They needed Achilles. The problem: Achilles was gone. Tethys, seeing the ships gathering, had acted immediately. She knew that her son, trained by heroes and blessed with the strength of the gods, would race toward the sound of battle. She had to protect him from his own destiny. She took Achilles from his home, sailing him to the isolated island kingdom of Skyros, ruled by King Coleman. She begged the king to hide her son, to protect him from the recruiters and the draft that was sweeping the land. King Coleman agreed. But how do you hide the most famous budding warrior in the world? Tethys devised a plan that was both desperate and cruel. She forced Achilles to shed his armor and his weapons. She made him grow out his golden hair, binding it with silks. She dressed him in the fine robes and fabrics worn by the princesses of the court. The greatest warrior alive would hide where no one would ever think to look, among the king's daughters, disguised as a maiden. Achilles, now called Pyrrha, the red-haired girl, lived in the women's quarters, learning to weave, surrounded by music and dance, while the world prepared for the greatest war of the generation. Achilles was miserable. He was built for the spear, not the loom. His divine strength made the deception almost impossible. He moved with the coiled grace of a predator, not the gentle steps of a court maiden. The daughters of the king whispered about their new companion, about her strange height, her deep voice, and the frightening strength in her hands. But they kept the secret. 4 months, Achilles chafed under the disguise, trapped by his mother's love and his oath to King Coleman. Back on the mainland, High King Mason grew desperate. The fleet was ready, but their champion was missing. He gave the impossible task of finding Achilles to one man, Agent Oliver. Oliver was not a great warrior like the others. He was something far more dangerous. He was the smartest man in the kingdom. Where others saw a wall, Oliver saw a dozen ways through it. He was a master of psychology, strategy, and deception. Oliver knew Achilles was not dead. He also knew Tethys would do anything to keep her son from the war. Where would a goddess hide a warrior? Oliver reasoned that she would not hide him in an army, or a monastery, or a cave. She would hide him in the one place where masculinity itself was forbidden. Oliver followed the whispers, tracking rumors of a new princess at the remote island court of King Coleman. He loaded a ship, not with soldiers, but with treasures, and set sail, disguised as a traveling merchant selling exotic goods to the royal court. King Coleman, obligated by the laws of hospitality, had to let the merchant in. Oliver was brought before the queen and the princesses, including the tall, brooding, and strangely beautiful Pyrrha. Oliver bowed, opening his trunks. "Gifts for the royal court," he announced, his voice smooth. He presented exquisite silks from the east, magnificent necklaces of amber and pearl, and intricate golden bracelets. The princesses rushed forward, delighted, trying on the jewelry, admiring the fabrics, lost in the glitter of the treasure. All except one. Pyrrha, Achilles, stood back, his eyes dark with contempt. He looked at the jewelry as if it were garbage. His eyes were not on the silk, they were on the horizon, listening to the distant crash of the waves, dreaming of the clash of steel. Oliver watched him. He knew. "I have items for every taste," Oliver said casually, digging deeper into another trunk. "Jewelry for the beautiful, and utility for the practical." From beneath a pile of purple cloth, Oliver pulled out two more items. One was a perfectly balanced, razor-sharp bronze sword, its hilt gleaming. The other was a heavy, polished shield, emblazoned with the crest of a charging lion. He placed them deliberately on the floor, separate from the jewels. Achilles saw the weapons, and his entire demeanor changed. His apathy vanished, replaced by a burning intensity. He took half a step toward the sword before realizing where he was, catching himself just in time. But Oliver had seen the hunger in his eyes. Now, it was time to spring the trap. Turning to his men waiting by the door, Oliver gave a sharp nod. A moment later, his soldiers outside sounded the battle alarm. Trumpets blasted the call to arms. Men shouted that pirate ships were spotted approaching the harbor, creating the perfect illusion of a sudden attack on the palace. The reaction was immediate. The princesses screamed and scattered, clutching their new jewelry, running for safety. King Coleman shouted for his guards. But Achilles, the warrior Pyrrha, did not run from the danger. He ran toward it. The months of humiliation, the frustration of the loom, the agony of hiding, it all erupted in a single, instinctive act. Ignoring the silks and the screaming, Achilles sprinted past the scattered pearls, ripped off his veil, and seized the weapons. He grabbed the sword, testing its weight, and lifted the shield, his body instantly falling into a perfect, deadly combat stance. He was no longer a princess. He was a lion unleashed. The alarm stopped. The shouting ceased. The room fell silent. The princesses stared, stunned. King Coleman looked horrified. Achilles stood alone in the center of the room, breathing heavily, gripping the sword, realizing what he had done. Agent Oliver walked toward him, a slow smile spreading across his face. He didn't look at the disguised prince with anger, but with profound admiration. "The jewelry is beautiful," Oliver said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "But the sword, I think, suits you better. Lord Achilles." The ruse was over. Achilles dropped the shield, his disguise revealed, his secret exposed. He was trapped. Oliver wasted no time. "High King Mason has launched the fleet. They are sailing for Troy, with or without you. Your mother hid you here to give you a long life. She has given you peace." Oliver paused, gesturing toward the sword still clutched in Achilles' hand. "I," he said, "am offering you immortality." Achilles looked at the sword. He heard the echoes of the oracle in his mind, a long, forgotten life, or a short, glorious one. By picking up the sword, his choice had already been made. He would not live in the shadows. He would not die of old age. He was Achilles. He was a warrior. And his destiny was waiting for him at Troy. Achilles stepped out of the palace of Skyros, leaving his life as the maiden Pyrrha, behind like a discarded costume. Agent Oliver, the clever recruiter, had promised him immortality, and Achilles intended to collect it. But Achilles would not arrive at the war front as a mere soldier reporting for duty. He was a prince, and he would bring his own army. He summoned the warriors sworn to his father, the legions known only as the Myrmidons. These were not ordinary men. They were a force of nature, forged in the rugged mountains of his homeland. They were terrifying, ant-like in their silent, unified precision, and they felt loyalty to no high king, only to their golden prince. They moved as one shadow, fought as one blade, and they viewed Achilles not just as a commander, but as a demigod. With the Myrmidons at his back, Achilles joined the massive allied fleet gathering at the port of Aulis. The sight was staggering. 1,000 ships, carrying the greatest warriors of the age, sat ready in the harbor. But they were not sailing. There was no wind. The sails hung limp. The sea was glass. Days turned into a week, and the week turned into a month. The massive army grew restless, consuming supplies, while the air remained deathly still. High King Mason demanded answers from his oracles. The prophets returned, pale and trembling. The gods were angry. Specifically, a goddess of the hunt had been offended by Mason's arrogance, and she had becalmed the seas. She demanded payment for the fleet to sail. The payment, the oracle declared, must be the thing Mason held most dear. To win the war, he must sacrifice his own daughter, Ivy. The army was horrified. But High King Mason, consumed by his ambition and the burning need to conquer Troy, looked at the 1,000 ships and the demands of fate, and he made a king's terrible calculation. He chose ambition. He knew his daughter would never come willingly to her own death. So, he devised a lie, and he used the honor of Achilles to seal it. Mason sent a messenger to his wife, telling her to send Ivy to the port immediately, for she was to be married. She was to become the wife of the greatest warrior alive, Achilles. Achilles knew nothing of this plot. When Ivy arrived, dressed for a wedding, she was seized by the priests. Achilles was furious. His name, his reputation, had been used in a despicable bait and switch, a violation of trust that stained his own honor. He tried to intervene, but Mason's soldiers held the camp, and the priests completed their dark ritual. The sacrifice was made. And that very evening, a horrible, strong wind rose from the west, filling the sails. The army got what it wanted. The fleet sailed for Troy, leaving Achilles standing on the shore, staring at the High King Mason with a cold, simmering hatred. The war had begun with a betrayal, and Achilles would not forget it. The allies landed hard on the shores of Troy, and the war began. And the war dragged. And the war stalled. For 9 long, brutal, bloody years, the two greatest armies in the world tore each other apart outside the unbreakable walls of Troy. Achilles was everything the prophecy had promised. He was a whirlwind. He was a force that could not be stopped. The water of the Styx protected him, and his supernatural skill guided his spear. The greatest Trojan champions, led by their noble prince, Hector, fought bravely, but even Hector refused to meet Achilles in single combat. Entire platoons would break and run the moment they saw his golden armor flashing in the sun. But the city did not fall. The war settled into a bitter, grinding stalemate. We now arrive at the 10th year. The 10th year since the winds changed. The camp was filthy, the soldiers were tired, and the animosity between the commanders was at a breaking point. The fragile alliance, built on Mason's ambition, was about to shatter. Following a recent raid on a nearby town allied with Troy, the allied army divided their spoils. As was the custom, the great warriors and kings were given prizes to mark their honor. High King Mason, as the leader, was given a captured maiden named Cassia. Achilles, in recognition of being the greatest fighter, was given his own prize, a woman named Brianna. This was the way of their world. These prizes were status symbols, public recognition of their value to the army. To lose that prize was to lose face. A few days later, disaster struck the camp. A sickness, a horrifying plague, swept through the ranks. Men died choking in their tents. The army was falling apart, defeated not by Trojan spears, but by disease. The oracles were consulted again. The news was grim. The plague was a punishment from a god. The maiden Cassia, taken by Mason, was the daughter of a high priest of Apollo, and the god was now exacting his revenge. The plague would only stop if Cassia was returned, unharmed, to her father. King Mason was furious. In a public assembly of all the commanders, he was accused, shamed, and forced to give up his prize. Before the entire army, Mason backed down. He agreed to return Cassia to stop the plague. But Mason's pride was wounded. He had been publicly humiliated. He looked out at the assembly and his eyes landed on Achilles, who stared back with that same cold contempt he had shown at Aulis. Mason decided in that moment that if he was to be shamed, he would not be shamed alone. "I will give up my prize," Mason announced to the army. "But I am the High King. I will not be left empty-handed while my inferiors keep their treasures. Since I must give up Cassia, I will take compensation. I claim the prize of Achilles. I am taking the woman, Brianna. Guards, go to his tent and retrieve her." The entire camp fell deathly silent. This was not a disagreement. This was a catastrophic insult. This was not about Brianna. This was about honor. Mason, the man who used Achilles' name to sacrifice his own daughter, was now publicly robbing Achilles of his earned status. He was treating the Invincible Warrior like a common soldier, a subordinate whose property could be seized at the whim of a politician. Achilles, who had held the line for 9 years, finally snapped. The rage that boiled in his blood was more than human fury. It was divine, uncontrollable, and absolute. He took one step forward, and his hand gripped the hilt of his sword. He was going to cut High King Mason in half, right there, in front of everyone. The war could collapse, Troy could win, the world could burn. He did not care. Only the sudden intervention of Agent Oliver, who stepped between them, and the desperate pleading of his oldest advisors, stopped his hand. Achilles froze, his knuckles white, the sword halfway out of its sheath. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound he could barely speak. Finally, he pushed Oliver aside. He looked at Mason with eyes that promised death. But he let go of the sword. "Let him take her," Achilles spat, his voice lethally quiet. "Let the greedy king have his prize." He pulled off his helmet and threw it to the ground. "But hear my vow. As of this moment, I am finished. My Myrmidons are finished. We will not fight for you. We will not defend your ships. We will not lift one finger to help your failing war." He turned his back on the king and walked toward the beach. "I will sit in my tent," he roared so the whole army could hear. "And I will wait. I will wait until the Trojan fires are licking the hulls of your own ships. I will wait until the armies of Hector are slaughtering you by the dozens. And only when you, High King Mason, crawl on your knees to my tent and publicly beg my forgiveness and return what you have stolen, only then will I consider fighting again." Achilles stormed to his camp, locked himself in his tent, and did the unthinkable. He prayed to his goddess mother, Tethys. He prayed that the gods would abandon the allies. He prayed that Troy would win. He prayed for the total bloody defeat of the army he had once championed. Achilles held to his vow. While the allied armies marched out every dawn to meet the Trojans, Achilles and his Myrmidons remained in their camp by the sea. He did nothing. He paced his tent, he ate, he sang songs of old heroes, and he practiced with his weapons, sharpening his spear for a battle he refused to join. The only man who dared to speak to him was not a king or a strategist, but his dearest friend. His companion since childhood, his most trusted lieutenant, Patrick. Patrick was the opposite of Achilles. Where Achilles was rage, Patrick was compassion. Where Achilles was divine pride, Patrick was human empathy. He was a capable warrior, beloved by the troops, but he did not have the invincible skin or the burning fury of his friend. He watched the war from their camp, his heart breaking as he saw the men they had trained with, men they had eaten with for 9 years, being slaughtered. "How long, Achilles?" Patrick would ask, day after day. "How long will you let your anger burn hotter than your loyalty? These are our friends. They are dying because you are sitting here." "They are dying," Achilles would answer, his voice cold iron, "because their high king is a thief and a fool. Mason wanted a war. Let him fight it. They insulted honor. Without honor, what is there left to fight for? What is there left to die for? I will not move." On the battlefield, the absence of Achilles was not just a gap in the line. It was a catastrophic collapse of morale for the Allies, and a roaring explosion of confidence for the Trojans. The Trojans were led by their greatest prince, Hector. Hector was everything Achilles was not. He was not a demigod. He was completely mortal. He did not fight for glory, though he had plenty of it. He fought for something simpler: his home, his wife, his infant son, and his city. He was the noble defender, the perfect soldier, the man who held the walls against the invaders. And without Achilles on the field to check him, Hector was unstoppable. The tide of the war turned instantly and violently. The Allies, who had spent 9 years pushing the Trojans back to their walls, were now the ones in full retreat. The Allied commanders tried desperately to stop the bleeding. King Miles, the man whose wife had started the war, finally met the prince, Perry, in single combat. But Perry, who was a lover and not a warrior, panicked and was saved only by the chaos of the battle. The mighty warrior Jax, a man of giant stature and brute strength, stepped forward to challenge Hector himself. The two champions fought for an entire day, a grinding duel of spear and shield, battling to an exhausted stalemate. But individual duels could not stop the Trojan army. Hector was organized, inspired, and relentless. He pushed the allies back, past the plains, past their old camps, all the way back to the beach. The allies were now trapped against the ocean. Their backs were to the sea. In total panic, they built a massive defensive wall of timber and earth around their own ships, turning their beachhead into a desperate fortress. The war was lost. King Mason realized, too late, what his arrogance had cost them. That night, humiliated and terrified, High King Mason swallowed his pride. He knew he could not approach Achilles himself. Instead, he assembled an embassy, a delegation comprised of the only men Achilles might actually listen to, the clever agent Oliver, the mighty warrior Jax, and an old mentor named Phoenix, who had helped raise Achilles as a boy. They were authorized to offer Achilles anything. The 3 men walked through the silent Myrmidon camp to the tent of the Golden Warrior. They found him sitting quietly, holding his lyre. Oliver spoke first. He was a master negotiator, laying out the terms logically. Achilles, he said, the army is broken. The war is over, unless you return. High King Mason offers his deepest public apology. He will return the woman, Brianna, untouched. Furthermore, he will give you 7 cities, tons of gold from his personal treasury, and his own daughter in marriage. Phoenix, the old teacher, spoke next, appealing to his emotions, reminding him of his duty, of the men who looked up to him. Jack spoke last, blunt and simple. We are dying out there. We need you. Stop being a stubborn child. Achilles listened to them all, his face unreadable. When they were finished, he set the lyre down. He looked at Oliver, and his voice was heavy with a sorrow that was deeper than his anger. It's not about the gold, Oliver, Achilles said quietly. It's not about the cities. It is not even about Brianna. It is about the oath. It is about the lie. He stood up, his massive frame filling the tent. He publicly declared that my honor is worthless. That my prizes, my status, earned with my blood, can be taken by him like a bully stealing candy. And now you come here offering me more candy, to forget it. He shook his head. My mother, Tethys, reminded me of the prophecy when I joined this war. You all know it. I have 2 futures. If I stay here, if I fight, I will die at Troy. That is my price. I accepted that price in exchange for eternal glory. But if the very honor I am dying for can be stolen by the man I am dying for, what is the point? Why should I trade my one life for a king who spat on me? Achilles turned his back on them. Go back to Mason. Tell him his offers are wind. I reject them all. In fact, tell him I am loading my ships. At dawn tomorrow, my myrmidons and I are sailing home. I am choosing the long life after all. I will die an old man, and you can all die here, on this beach, for your arrogant king. The embassy had failed. Oliver and Jax left the tent, their hearts heavy with doom. As they walked back to the Allied lines, the night erupted. Shouts of alarm echoed across the beach. The Trojans were not waiting for morning. Hector, sensing the Allies' desperation, had ordered a full-scale night assault against the defensive wall. The Allied soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, could not hold them. The sound of cracking timber echoed across the camp as the Trojans breached the final wall. Hector and his army poured through the gap. The Allies were trapped. From his tent, Achilles heard the screams. He walked to the flap of his tent and looked out. In the distance, against the dark ocean, he saw a bright new light. A Trojan soldier, under Hector's command, had thrown the first torch. One of the Allied ships, their only escape route, was catching fire. The roar of the flames was now louder than the screams of the dying. Hector, having breached the final wall, had pushed the Allied forces into a desperate, shrinking circle against the waves. The first line of ships was ablaze, the black smoke blotting out the sun, the air thick with the smell of burning pitch and human panic. This was the end of the war. From the hill of his camp, Achilles watched the catastrophe his pride had created. He gripped the hilt of his sword, his heart a cold knot of rage, but his vow held him chained. Patrick stood beside him, watching the same scene, and something inside him finally shattered. He was not a demigod. He was a man, watching his friends, his comrades of 10 years, being systematically annihilated. He turned to Achilles, his face pale, tears of genuine fury streaming through the dirt on his cheeks. Are you satisfied? Patrick screamed, shoving his friend. Are you watching this? Your honor is safe, but they are burning our path home. Even if you want to leave, you can't. Your stubbornness hasn't just doomed them, Achilles, it has doomed us. Achilles stared at the fire, shaken. He had wanted High King Mason to suffer. He had wanted the Allies to beg. He had not calculated the totality of Hector's success. He did not have an answer. If you will not break your vow, Patrick said, his voice dropping, suddenly clear and intense. If your pride means more to you than our lives, then let me save them. Achilles turned to him, confused. What are you talking about? I know why they are losing, Patrick said, the plan forming in his mind. They are losing because they don't see you. The Trojans only fear one thing. They fear your armor. They fear the idea of you. Patrick stepped closer, grabbing the front of Achilles' tunic. Let me fight. Let me wear your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons. Achilles stared at him, horrified by the suggestion. Think, Patrick urged. The Myrmidons are fresh. They are desperate to fight. The Trojans are exhausted from breaking the wall. If they see your golden armor leading a fresh charge of thousands of elite troops, they will break. They will believe their doom has come. The armor will win the battle, Achilles, not the man inside it. We can save the ships. Achilles saw the desperate genius of the plan. It was the only way. He could keep his vow. He would not be fighting for Mason, while Patrick saved the fleet from destruction. But he also knew the terrible danger. His armor was a beacon, a magnet for the enemy's greatest champions. "All right," Achilles said, his voice heavy. He made the decision. "Take the armor. Take the chariots. Lead the myrmidons." He began strapping the divine plates onto his friend, covering Patrick's mortal body with the invincible protection forged by the gods. When he was finished, he gripped his friend by the shoulders, his golden eyes burning into Patrick's. "You must swear an oath to me now. This is not a request, Patrick. This is an order." "Anything," Patrick said, his heart hammering with adrenaline and terror. "Your mission is one," Achilles commanded. "You have one objective: save the ships. You will charge the beach. You will push the Trojans away from the fire. You will drive them back onto the open plain. And the moment the ships are safe, you stop. You return to this camp. Do you understand me?" Achilles shook him. "Do not get lost in the glory. Do not let the fight pull you toward the city. The walls of Troy are not your destiny. If you chase them, if you go near those walls, you will die. Swear it." "I swear," Patrick promised, his voice muffled by the famous, terrifying helmet. "I will save the ships and return." Patrick, now looking exactly like the Invincible Warrior himself, stepped out into the daylight. The resting myrmidons saw the golden armor, and they saw the war chariot being prepared. They erupted in a single, deafening cheer. Their master had returned. Patrick leaped into the chariot. The myrmidons fell into their perfect, deadly formations behind him. With a sound like rolling thunder, the fresh army surged down the hill and crashed into the flank of the celebrating Trojan forces. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A Trojan soldier, torch in hand, ready to set the next ship ablaze, looked up. His face went white. He dropped the torch. "Achilles!" he screamed. "It is Achilles! Achilles has returned!" The word spread through the Trojan ranks like a plague of fear. They had been fighting exhausted, demoralized men. Now, the invincible demigod, fresh, enraged, and backed by his legion of butchers, had joined the fray. It was not a battle. It was a rout. The Trojans, who were moments from total victory, broke ranks and fled in pure terror. They scrambled back over the wall they had just broken, trampling each other to get away from the golden warrior who moved among them like a reaping whirlwind. Patrick fought like a man possessed. Infused with the power of the armor and the adoration of the army, he felt superhuman. He drove the Trojans from the beach. He saved the ships. He pushed the enemy back, past the allied wall, and onto the wide open plains of Troy. His mission was complete. The allies were safe. The fleet was saved. Patrick stopped his chariot, breathing heavily, watching the entire Trojan army sprinting in chaos back toward the safety of their city. He heard Achilles' warning echoing in his ears: "Stop. Come back." But the adrenaline of the fight, the feeling of divine power, the roar of the myrmidons begging him to continue, it was the most intoxicating feeling he had ever known. He looked at the fleeing army, and he looked at the high, unbreakable walls of Troy in the distance. He thought, "They are broken. I can end this. I can end the whole war, right now." In that moment of fatal pride, Patrick forgot his oath. He turned his gaze from the safety of the camp and fixed it on the main gate of Troy. He raised the spear of Achilles high in the air, let out a war cry that mimicked his friend's, and ordered the chariots to charge. He was chasing the Trojans home. Patrick tasted immortality, and it was a poison. Wearing the armor of a demigod, he felt invincible. He had single-handedly routed the Trojan army. He had saved the allied fleet. He had fulfilled his mission. But Achilles' warning was now just a distant whisper, drowned out by the roar of victory and the thunder of his myrmidons urging him forward. He was no longer Patrick, the loyal friend. In his own mind, he was Achilles. He chased the fleeing Trojans across the plain, cutting down champions who never dared stand against the golden armor. The retreat turned into a stampede. The allies, seeing their champion charging the city itself, rallied behind him, their morale restored, and the entire allied army surged toward the walls of Troy. Patrick reached the legendary Scaean Gate, the main entrance to the city. He saw the Trojans trapped in a bottleneck, desperate to get inside, and he saw his chance. He believed he could break the gate, end the war, and accomplish what Achilles himself had failed to do in 9 years. He drove his chariot into the mass of retreating soldiers. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. And he was doomed. He leaped from the chariot and attempted to scale the massive, God-built wall. Once, twice, 3 times, he tried to climb, energized by a strength that was not his own. On his 3rd attempt, just as his fingers grasped the parapet, a force intervened. This was Troy, a city protected by higher powers. A blinding light, brighter than the midday sun, flashed from the stones. An invisible hand, the divine guardian of the city, struck Patrick square in the chest. The blow was not physical, but it was absolute. It sent him staggering backward, his senses reeling. The force of the divine strike was so great that the straps on the divine armor snapped. The heavy bronze helmet, the famous helmet of Achilles that terrified the world, was knocked clean from his head, rolling in the dust. The breastplate and greaves clattered loose, leaving him exposed. He stood there, stunned, dizzy, and suddenly mortal. He was just Patrick again, his hair matted with sweat, standing helmetless before the enemy. A minor Trojan captain, seeing the Golden Warrior suddenly vulnerable and confused, seized the opportunity. He hurled his javelin from a distance. Without the breastplate, the spear struck true, piercing Patrick deep in the back. It was an agonizing wound, but it was not the killing blow. Patrick roared in pain, turning to find his attacker, but he was already weak. And then, the chaos at the gate parted. Hector, the great prince of Troy, had been organizing the retreat when he saw the commotion. He saw the allied champions stagger. He saw the helmet roll, and he stared at the face of the man who had caused the rout. His eyes widened. It was not Achilles. It was an imposter. Enraged by the deception and seeing his moment, Hector stepped forward. He did not hesitate. Patrick, bleeding, weak, and stripped of his divine protection, saw the true hero of Troy approaching. He tried to lift his spear, but he had no strength left. Hector looked at the man who wore his greatest rival's armor. "You thought you could wear the lion's skin," Hector said, his voice cold with contempt. "You flew too close to the sun, little bird." Hector leveled his heavy spear and drove it directly through Patrick's chest, ending his life. Patrick collapsed into the Trojan dust, the mortal wound silencing his ambition forever. He gasped, his life draining away, but he used his last breath to deliver a prophecy of his own. "You are proud of this, Hector," Patrick whispered. "But you were only the 3rd. Fate struck me first, the gods struck me second. You were just the man who finished the job. But he is coming. Listen to me. He is coming for you. And your own death. Your death is already waiting by this very gate." Hector, triumphant, ignored the dying man's curse. He placed his boot on Patrick's chest and did the unthinkable. He stripped the remaining pieces of the divine armor, the last vestiges of Achilles' glory, from Patrick's body. He lifted the golden pieces high in the air for the Trojan army to see. He had not only killed the man who routed them, he had taken the legendary armor of Achilles himself as his prize. A desperate, bloody battle erupted right there, not for the city, but for the body. The mighty warrior Jax and King Miles charged forward, fighting with superhuman strength to recover the corpse of their friend, preventing the Trojans from desecrating it. They succeeded, barely, carrying the naked body of Patrick back toward the allied camp, leaving Hector in possession of the armor. Back by the ships, Achilles had been listening. The sounds of battle had moved from the beach to the plains, and then, impossibly, to the very walls of the city. He knew instantly that Patrick had broken his oath. He stood, frozen in dread, staring at the gate, waiting for the news he knew was coming. A runner sprinted into the camp, collapsing at his feet, sobbing. "He is dead," the messenger choked out. Lord Patrick is dead. He charged the wall. Hector killed him." The runner paused, unable to say the worst part. "And Hector, he has your armor." For a full minute, Achilles did not move. The world stopped. The sound of the waves, the sounds of the distant battle, the wind, everything went silent. The cold, calculated rage he had felt for King Mason was nothing. That was an insult to his pride. This was the death of his soul. Then, he let out a sound. It was not a word. It was a roar of cosmic agony, a sound so terrifying, so inhuman, that every soldier, ally and Trojan alike, heard it across the plain and froze. Achilles fell to his knees. He tore at his hair. He clawed the dirt, pouring dust and ashes over his head, screaming his friend's name. The rage he had nurtured for weeks was gone, instantly replaced by a black hole of grief so profound it threatened to swallow the world. And then, the grief curdled. It hardened. It turned into something new. Something the world had never seen. His vow to sit out the war was gone. His hatred of King Mason was forgotten. His mother's prophecy, his own life, his fate, none of it mattered. A new, terrifying clarity filled the void. Patrick was dead. Hector had killed him. And Hector was wearing his armor. Achilles stood up, the tears on his face streaked with the ash of the campfires. He had only one purpose left on earth. He was going to kill Hector. The sound that tore itself from the throat of Achilles was not human. It was the sound of a fractured prophecy, the roar of a soul breaking in half. It was a scream of such profound, unnatural agony that it ripped across the Aegean Sea, and his mother, the sea goddess Tethys, heard it in her coral palaces deep beneath the waves. She rose from the ocean, shimmering, and found her son on the beach, not defiant, not enraged, but broken. He was on his knees in the dirt, covered in the ashes of the signal fires, clawing the earth, howling over the naked, ruined body of Patrick, which the warriors Jax and Miles had finally recovered from the battlefield. Tethys rushed to him, wrapping her immortal arms around her grieving son. Achilles looked up, his eyes unrecognizable, swollen, and dead. All the fire of his pride was gone, replaced by a black, icy void. "He killed him," Achilles whispered, his voice hoarse. "Mother, he killed him while wearing my armor. Hector did this. Now, I am going out there, and I am going to kill Hector." Tethys let out her own wail, a sound of divine sorrow, because she alone knew what that vow truly meant. "My son," she cried, "you cannot. Do you not understand the threads of your own life? The prophecy is bound. Your fate is tied directly to his. The oracles have declared that your own death is destined to follow swiftly after the death of Hector." She gripped his face, begging him to understand. "If you kill him, Achilles, you are choosing your own grave. You will never see your homeland again." Achilles stared through her, his gaze fixed on the walls of Troy in the distance. "Then I will die soon," he answered, his voice hollow. "My life ended the moment he fell. I should have been in that armor. Patrick died my death. My world is gone, mother. So I will trade the life I have left for his. Revenge is all I have. I will pay that price." Tethys saw the unbreakable iron in his eyes. His fate was sealed, chosen by his own hand. She wiped her immortal tears. "Then your fate it is. But you cannot go as you are. You are a warrior without armor. Hector, the man you hunt, is now wearing your divine protection, the armor the Styx water cannot pierce, the armor I gave you. You cannot fight him bare-chested." "I don't care," Achilles snarled. "But I do," Tethys commanded. "You will grieve. You will wait. Do not enter the battle until dawn. I will go to the high mountain of the gods, to the burning forge of the master craftsman, the divine smith who crafts the lightning itself. He owes me a great favor. Tonight, he will forge you a new set of armor. Armor worthy of a god. Armor worthy of your final battle." Tethys vanished back into the sea, ascending toward the heavens. Achilles remained on the beach next to the body of his friend. He would not allow Patrick to be burned, not yet. The funeral rites would wait. Patrick would not rest until he was avenged. As the afternoon turned to dusk, Achilles rose. His grief was now a cold, focused engine. He walked into the center of the Allied camp, bypassing his own tent, and heading straight for the headquarters of the High King. He stood before the commanders. High King Mason looked at the warrior, and he did not see the proud prince he had feuded with. He saw something terrifying. Achilles spoke, and his voice carried over the entire silent camp. "King Mason, let the quarrel between us be over. Let it be forgotten. My anger is finished. It was a useless, childish pride, and it has cost me everything I have ever loved. I am done with it." He looked at the shocked faces of the soldiers. "I want only one thing now. I want the war. Form the lines. I am returning." Mason, profoundly relieved and deeply terrified by this new, dead-eyed Achilles, rushed forward. He publicly accepted the truce, blaming the gods and fate for his own temporary madness that had caused the feud. He immediately ordered his men to fulfill his original promise. Soldiers brought the piles of gold, the bronze tripods, the horses, and they brought the maiden Brianna, the woman whose capture had started the entire feud, back to Achilles. Achilles looked at Brianna, the prize he had been willing to let the whole world burn for, and he felt absolutely nothing. He looked at the gold as if it were rocks. These were the toys of mortals, the prizes of a life he no longer lived. He simply nodded. "Put the gifts in my tent. Prepare the army. We attack at dawn." All night, Achilles sat awake by the sea, listening to the Trojans across the plains celebrating. They were banging their shields, singing songs of Hector, the hero who had killed the invincible Patrick and stolen the armor of Achilles. Just as the first hint of gray light touched the sky, Tethys returned. She did not rise from the sea, but descended from the clouds, carrying a bundle that glowed with its own internal fire. She laid the new armor at his feet. It was a masterpiece, forged in divine fire. The breastplate was brighter than silver, the helmet plumed with horsehair, the greaves perfectly molded. But the shield was a wonder. It was massive, forged of 5 layers of bronze, tin, silver, and gold. The divine forge master had etched the entire universe upon its face. In the center, he had forged the earth, the sun, the moon, and all the constellations of the stars. Around this, he had crafted 2 great cities. The first was a city at peace, people celebrating a wedding, dancers in the street, judges arguing a case in the public square. The second was a city at war, armies clashing, an ambush waiting in a ravine, soldiers dragging the dead. Around the cities, he showed the work of mankind, farmers plowing a field, workers harvesting grapes from a vineyard, shepherds guarding their sheep from lions. And circling the entire rim of the shield, he forged the great, swirling river of ocean, binding the whole world together. It was a shield that contained everything Achilles was fighting for. It was the world he was protecting, and the world he was now agreeing to leave forever. Achilles stood up. He picked up the armor. He strapped on the greaves, the breastplate, the helmet. He grabbed the heavy spear, tipped with bronze, and lifted the magnificent shield. The allied soldiers, gathering for the morning assault, looked on in absolute awe. The armor glowed, reflecting the first rays of the dawn, making Achilles appear to be a man literally on fire. He was no longer their golden prince. He was divine light. He was the physical manifestation of vengeance. He climbed into his war chariot, his immortal horses screaming, sensing the god magic. Achilles looked across the plain, toward the gates of Troy, and he screamed one single word that echoed like the crack of doom. Hector! Achilles' chariot did not roll, it flew. Propelled by immortal horses and a rage that burned brighter than the divine armor he wore, he crossed the plain between the camps in seconds. The Myrmidons followed, a disciplined wave of silent death, but even they could not keep pace with their master. The Trojans, many still drunk or sleeping off the victory celebration from the night before, heard the scream. They stumbled from their tents and saw a vision from hell. It was Achilles, yes, but not the prince they had known. This Achilles was wreathed in a light that was not the sun. He looked like an avenging god, and he was moving faster than any mortal man. Their courage, built upon Hector's victory over Patrick, vanished in a single, collective heartbeat. The Trojan lines didn't just break, they evaporated. Achilles hit their front rank like a thunderbolt, and the slaughter began. This was not war. It was a harvest. Achilles was no longer a soldier seeking victory. He was an executioner seeking a single signature. He screamed, "Hector," as he fought, but Hector was nowhere to be found. So, Achilles killed everyone who stood between them. He moved with the grace of his sea goddess mother and the strength of the divine forge. Spears thrown at him shattered against the new shield or bounced harmlessly from the breastplate. He was untouched, a whirlwind of bronze and gold, cutting through the terrified Trojan ranks. The army split, running in pure panic. Hector, wearing the armor he had stripped from Patrick, tried to rally his men. He felt brave in Achilles' old protection. But when he saw the glowing figure on the battlefield, when he saw the new armor, and the trail of bodies Achilles left in his wake, even Hector, the bravest man in Troy, felt his blood turn to ice. This was not the man he had fought before. This was a monster. Achilles, in his blind fury, drove half the remaining Trojan army not toward the city, but sideways, toward the great wide river that bordered the plain. He trapped them against the banks. With nowhere left to run, the Trojans leaped into the deep water by the hundreds, hoping to swim to the other side. Achilles leaped in after them. The river, which the locals called the Scamander, turned dark red. Achilles stood waist deep in the current and continued the slaughter. He cut men down as they tried to swim, his spear flashing. He killed and killed and killed, until the river itself was no longer flowing. It was choked. The current was dammed by a horrific logjam of corpses, shields, and broken chariots. And then, the river fought back. The water, the very spirit of the Trojan land, angered by this defilement, rose up. The river, personified as a roaring force of nature, swelled its banks. It became a churning, muddy wave, a wall of water filled with the corpses of Achilles' own victims, and it crashed down upon him. The river spirit tried to drown the Invincible Warrior. The current wrapped around his legs, pulling him under with the weight of the dead. For the first time, Achilles was in peril. His new armor was heavy, and his invincible skin meant nothing against the crushing pressure of 1,000 tons of water. He could not breathe. This enraged him further. Trapped beneath the flood, Achilles roared. He would not be stopped by a river. He fought the water itself, using his divine strength to claw his way out, pushing against the supernatural torrent. He finally burst from the surface, gasping, covered in mud and gore, having survived a force that would have killed any mortal army. The river retreated, boiling, but he was free. He stood on the far bank, having defeated the land and the water. Now, only the city remained. He resumed his hunt. The survivors of the river and the rest of the Trojan army were in a full stampede, sprinting for the one place of safety, the main gates of Troy. On the highest tower of the city walls, the elderly king of Troy, King Preston, watched in absolute, paralyzing horror. He saw the glowing monster that was once Achilles. He saw half his army destroyed in the river. He saw the rest fleeing in terror. The gates! King Preston screamed at his guards, his old voice cracking with fear. Open the gates! Let them in! Let everyone in, right now. But the second the army is safe, shut the doors. Bolt them! Do not let that thing inside our walls. The massive bronze gates of Troy swung open, and the terrified, broken remnants of the Trojan army poured through in a wave of human panic. They scrambled, crawled, and trampled each other to get to safety, streaming past the gatekeepers. Achilles, seeing his prey escaping, ran faster, his divine armor flashing. The gatekeepers watched him coming. Close it! Close it now, they shouted. They began to push the massive doors shut. The last of the soldiers tumbled inside. The city was safe. But as the heavy gates began to groan shut, King Preston and his wife, Queen Heather, screamed from the ramparts. No! Wait! Wait! The gatekeepers stopped. Everyone on the walls stared down in disbelief. The entire Trojan army was inside. All except one man. Hector stood alone on the plain. He was outside the walls. He watched his men scramble to safety, and he heard the gates begin to close behind him, trapping him outside. From the walls, his father, King Preston, begged him. Hector! My son, come inside. Don't fight him. He is not a man, he is a plague. Save yourself. His mother, Queen Heather, wept, pleading for him to run. But Hector stood his ground, rooted to the spot. He looked down at the armor he wore, the stolen armor of Achilles. His pride had cost the Trojans this battle. His decision to kill Patrick had unleashed this demon. He knew his honor demanded that he not run. He was the only thing left standing between Achilles and the city of Troy. He watched the glowing warrior sprint across the plain, coming directly for him. And he waited. Achilles, glowing in his divine armor, sprinted toward the Scaean gate. Hector stood alone on the dust-blown plain, trapped. Behind him, the massive bronze doors of his home were bolted shut. Before him was the unstoppable engine of vengeance that he himself had unleashed. From the high ramparts, his father, King Preston, stretched his hands out, begging. Hector! My son, my greatest son, do not stand against this man. He is not a man. He is a plague sent by the gods. Come back to the walls. Let us throw down ropes. Do not fight him. He will kill you, and Troy will fall. His mother, Queen Heather, wept, screaming his name, pleading for him to save himself. Hector heard them, but he was bound by his honor. He had killed Patrick. He had brought this doom upon his own city. He was the only champion left. He had to fight. He held his shield, steadying his breathing, preparing for the clash. But as Achilles drew closer, his new armor blazing like a fallen star, his eyes burning with a grief that looked like madness, Hector's legendary courage finally, and fatally, shattered. This was not a mortal. This was death itself, come to collect a debt. When Achilles was only yards away, Hector did the unthinkable. He panicked. He turned his back on his enemy and he ran. Achilles, the fastest man alive, pursued him. The two greatest champions of the age, one predator and one prey, began a desperate race. They ran 3 full laps around the massive circumference of the walls of Troy. The allied army stood watching in stunned silence. The entire population of Troy watched from the ramparts, weeping as they saw their only hero fleeing for his life, unable to escape the golden demon chasing his heels. As Hector passed the main gate for the 3rd time, exhausted, his lungs on fire, his spirit broken, he saw a vision. Standing near the watchtower, clear as day, was his favorite brother, Dylan. Hector! The vision of Dylan called out, holding up a fresh spear. Stop running! Why do you flee? Let us face him together. I am here with you. Seeing his brother, believing he was no longer alone, Hector's courage flooded back. He stopped running. He turned, gasping for air, and faced his pursuer. The chase was over. Achilles stopped, looming over him, a terrifying figure of light and rage. Hector, trying to buy a moment to breathe, held up his hand. Achilles, hear me. Before we fight, let us swear an oath before the gods. If I defeat you, I will take your magnificent armor as my prize, but I swear on my honor I will return your body to your friends for burial. If you defeat me, do the same. Take my armor, but accept the ransom my father will pay, my weight in gold, and give my body back to my people." Achilles stared at him, and his lip curled in a snarl of pure, undiluted hatred. "Do lions make oaths with sheep?" Achilles spat. "Do wolves make pacts with men? There are no terms between us. There is no oath that holds us. There is only what you did. You killed Patrick. You stripped him, and you wore his armor in pride. You will pay for every tear he shed. Pray to your gods, Hector. They cannot save you." Achilles did not wait. He reared back and hurled his new, god-forged spear. Hector, a brilliant warrior, reacted instantly. He ducked. The spear whistled over his head and vanished. Hector smiled, believing fate had given him the first advantage. He set his feet, aimed his own heavy spear perfectly, and threw it with all his strength. The spear flew true and struck the center of Achilles' new shield, the shield forged by the creator smith. The bronze spearhead, which had killed dozens of men, hit the divine metal, blunted, and bounced off harmlessly, clattering to the dust. Hector was now defenseless. But he was not afraid. He still had his brother. He turned. "Dylan, your spear. Throw me your spear now." But there was no one there. The watchtower was empty. Dylan was safe inside the walls. It had been a hallucination, a cruel trick of fate, of the gods, to make him stop running. In that instant, Hector knew. He was doomed. He was going to die, alone, outside the walls of his city. But he was the Prince of Troy. He would not die begging, and he would not die running. Hector drew his last weapon, his heavy bronze sword, and with his final surge of strength, he let out his own battle cry and charged the demigod. Achilles charged to meet him, his own spear now magically back in his hand, returned by an unseen, divine wind. As Hector raised his sword, Achilles did not look at the blade. He looked at the armor Hector was wearing. It was his old armor. He knew it better than the man who had stolen it. He had worn it for 9 years. He knew every buckle, every strap, and he knew its one, tiny imperfection. As Hector charged, the armor shifted. Achilles saw it. A small gap, where the neck guard meets the collarbone. The armor had been forged for Achilles, and it did not fit Hector perfectly. It left one, tiny, mortal spot exposed. As Hector lifted his sword to strike, Achilles lunged forward, under the sword arm, and drove his new spear with all his divine strength directly into that single, soft spot in the throat. The divine blade sliced through the flesh. Hector collapsed backward, his charge stopped, choking, the sword falling from his grasp. He fell to his knees, drowning in his own blood. Achilles stood over him, pulling the spear free. "I beg you." Hector gasped, holding his throat. "I beg you. Achilles, by your own father, by your mother who loves you, take the ransom. My father will give you whatever you ask. Gold, treasure, anything. Do not let the dogs of your camp tear my body. Give me back to my home." Achilles looked down at the man dying at his feet. His vengeance was not satisfied. His grief was still a screaming void. "Beg." Achilles snarled. "Do you beg me, dog? I only wish my rage was hot enough to allow me to carve the meat from your bones and eat it raw. That is the only payment you deserve for what you did to Patrick. No, there will be no ransom. The wild dogs and the vultures will feast on the hero of Troy. Your family will watch them do it from the walls." Hector, with his last dying breath, locked eyes with his killer. "Beware, Achilles," he choked out. "Your own fate is near. Here, by this very gate." And then the hero of Troy was dead. Achilles stood triumphant over his nemesis. The allies on the plain erupted in a massive cheer. The city of Troy let out a collective wail of despair. But Achilles stared at the body. Killing him was not enough. The rage had not subsided. The grief was still there. He had to erase Hector from the world. His vengeance, he decided, had only just begun. A deep, profound silence fell over the plains of Troy. The hero of the city, the man who had held the line for 10 years, was dead. From the Allied camp, a single, thunderous cheer erupted. From the walls of the city, a unified, piercing wail of despair answered it. Achilles stood over the body of his nemesis, breathing heavily, the divine armor glowing, his spear dripping. His vengeance was complete. But his grief was not. The rage that had fueled him, the black void left by Patrick, was still screaming inside him. Killing Hector had not filled it. He looked down at the man who had begged for honor in death. And Achilles decided that death was not punishment enough. He performed an act so horrific, so outside the bounds of civilized warfare, that it shocked both mortals and gods. He used his own knife and cut through the back of Hector's heels, an almost poetic mockery of his own single vulnerability. He threaded the thick leather straps of his war chariot through the tendons, binding the Prince of Troy by the ankles. He climbed into the chariot, cracked his whip, and screamed at his immortal horses. The chariot launched forward. Hector's body was dragged violently behind it. The noble head that had been kissed by his wife and child that very morning now bounced and dragged through the rocks and dust of the plain, his dark hair fanning out in the dirt. From the walls, the Trojans watched this ultimate desecration. Hector's mother, Queen Hector, screamed and began to tear at her own hair, falling to her knees. Hector's wife, Anna, who had been running to the rampart to see why the battle had stopped, saw the sight. She saw her husband's body being pulled like slaughtered cattle. She fainted, collapsing into the arms of her attendants. And King Preston, the old father, simply broke. He fell to the ground, covering his head with dirt, letting out a sound of grief so profound that it silenced the rest of the city. Achilles was deaf to their cries. He drove the chariot in 3 wide circles around the city of Troy, making sure every citizen saw the fate of their champion. Then, he turned the chariot and dragged the corpse all the way back to the Allied camp. He arrived at the tents, unstrapped the body, and threw the ruined corpse of Hector face down in the dirt, right next to the funeral bier that was being prepared for Patrick. He announced to the army that the dogs and vultures of the camp would feast on the man who had dared to kill his friend. Now, and only now, would he bury Patrick. The funeral was the grandest the world had ever seen. A massive pyre was built. Great sacrifices of oxen and horses were made. Achilles cut a lock of his own golden hair he had been growing as an offering to the river gods of his homeland, a homeland he now knew he would never see, and placed it in Patrick's cold hand. They lit the pyre. As his friend's body burned, Achilles stood sentinel, weeping openly for the first time since the news of his death. When the pyre turned to ash, they held the funeral games. The entire army participated, a brief respite from 10 years of war. They held chariot races, brutal boxing matches, which the giant warrior Jax won easily, and foot races where Agent Oliver showed his surprising speed. It was a day to honor the dead. But the next morning, Achilles awoke, and the grief was still there. The rage was still there. The wound in his soul was unhealed. Vengeance had not cured him. It had only poisoned him. He looked at the body of Hector, which lay where he had thrown it, untouched by the dogs, who seemed to fear the corpse. His madness returned. He tied Hector's body back to the chariot. He lashed the horses. And he dragged the Prince of Troy 3 times around the burial mound of Patrick, tearing at the ground, screaming his friend's name. He did this the next day, and the day after that. For 12 straight days, Achilles woke, his heart filled with blackness, and performed this horrific ritual. The Allied army watched in silence, their awe for their champion now curdling into disgust. This was not war. This was not honor. This was a sickness. But a strange miracle was occurring. Though dragged daily over rocks and dirt, the body of Hector remained whole. The skin did not tear. The flesh did not rot under the hot sun. The gods, watching from above, were horrified by Achilles' inhumanity. But they had also respected Hector, who had always honored them. They had intervened. While Achilles slept, divine protectors secretly mended the corpse, coating it in a sacred oil that prevented decay and protected it from the rocks. Hector remained pristine, despite the daily violation. On the 12th day, the highest gods decided this could not continue. Achilles' rage had violated the sacred laws of earth and heaven. The dead demand respect, even from their enemies. This wound, which covered the entire war, had to be healed. And they devised a plan, an impossible, terrifying plan that required an act of courage greater than any seen on the battlefield. They would not stop Achilles with force, they would stop him with humanity. For 12 days, Achilles performed his ritual of rage, and for 12 days, the gods protected Hector's body. Finally, the highest powers of Olympus could no longer tolerate the violation. Achilles' grief had curdled into a sin that was staining the very honor he claimed to fight for. They decided that the cycle of vengeance must be broken, not by force, but by a radical act of humility. First, they sent a message to the ocean. The sea goddess Tethys rose from the waves once more, finding her son in his tent. He was not raving. He was sitting in the dark, hollow-eyed, exhausted, haunted by the ghost of Patrick and the pristine corpse of the man he kept trying to destroy. "My son," Tethys said, her voice soft but firm. "The gods are angry. Your revenge has been served, but your actions now offend the heavens. This is not honor. This is madness. It is the will of the highest powers that this ends. You must release the body. You must accept a ransom." Achilles, tired beyond measure, his rage having burned itself down to cold, gray ash, finally nodded. The killing had not cured him. The desecration had not cured him. Perhaps obedience would. He agreed. But he sneered. Who would dare come here to ask for it? The gods had already answered that question. Across the plain, inside the besieged city, a divine message was delivered to the king. King Preston, who had been lying on the floor of his palace, refusing to eat, broken by grief, suddenly saw a blinding light. A divine voice spoke, commanding him to rise. "King Preston, your sorrow has been heard," the voice declared. "You will stop weeping, and you will act. You must gather the greatest ransom Troy possesses. You will load a cart, and you will go yourself in the dead of night, into the heart of the allied camp. You will go to the tent of Achilles, and you will ransom your son." This was not a suggestion. It was a suicide mission. King Preston's wife, Queen Heather, heard the plan and threw herself at his feet, begging him not to go. "He is a butcher," she wept. "He is a savage animal. The sentries will cut you down before you cross the trench. And if they don't, that monster will kill you where you stand. Do not leave me a widow and childless in the same month." King Preston gently moved her aside. His eyes, for the first time in 12 days, were clear. This act of courage was the only thing left he could do for his son. "I must," the old king said, his voice firm. "I held him the day he was born. I will hold him the day he is buried. If I must die in the tent of the man who killed him, just to beg for his body, then that is how I will die. I am going." Ignoring the screams of his family, the old king ordered his attendants to load a heavy wagon. Not with weapons, but with treasure. They piled it high with 12 priceless robes, 12 gold bars, bronze cauldrons, and the legendary golden cup of the Trojan kings. This was the wealth of a nation, offered for the body of one man. Driving the mule cart himself, with a single elderly attendant, King Preston rode out of the Scaean gate, into the darkness, toward the campfires of the enemy who had slaughtered his people. In the no-man's land between the city and the camp, a figure suddenly appeared in the moonlight. Preston stopped, terrified, reaching for a knife. The figure was a charismatic, handsome young man with a kind smile. "Do not be afraid, old king," the stranger said. "I am Mercury, the divine herald, the guide. The gods have sent me to protect you. No harm will come to you tonight." Preston realized he was in the presence of the divine. He lowered his head. Mercury smiled and walked beside the cart. As they approached the allied camp, the sentry standing guard by the main trench suddenly yawned, overwhelmed by a supernatural sleep. They slumped at their posts. Mercury walked the cart straight past them. They went deeper, past the tents of the mighty Jacks, past the headquarters of Agent Oliver, and even King Mason. Everyone was locked in a God-sent slumber. The divine herald guided the old king and his cart of gold through the sleeping hostile army, bringing him directly to the center of the camp, to the large, dark tent of the killer himself. "Here you are, brave father," Mercury whispered. "Go inside. Do not be afraid. You will find him ready to listen." And with that, the divine guide vanished. King Preston, his old heart hammering against his ribs, got down from the cart. He was alone, surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, standing before the hut of the monster who had murdered his family. Inside the tent, Achilles was sitting by the fire, brooding, his dinner untouched. He was restless, unable to sleep, haunted. His myrmidons were asleep nearby. The flap of the tent opened. Achilles looked up, annoyed, expecting a guard with a message. Instead, the elderly king of Troy, his mortal enemy, the father of the man Achilles had been dragging in the dirt for 12 days, walked past the weapons, into the light of the fire. Before Achilles could even register what was happening, King Preston collapsed at his feet, seizing the demigod's knees in supplication. And then, the old king did the most disarming thing imaginable. He lifted the hands of Achilles, the strong, lethal hands that had slaughtered his children, and he kissed them. Achilles sat frozen on his stool. His Myrmidon guards, roused by the unannounced entry, woke instantly, their hands flashing to their swords. But Achilles, stunned into silence, held up a single hand. "Stop." He stared at the old man kneeling in the dirt of his tent. This was King Preston, the ruler of Troy, the father of the man Achilles had killed, the father of the man whose corpse lay just outside, waiting for the dogs. And this king was kneeling, weeping, kissing the very hands that were stained with the blood of his children. Achilles had seen every kind of strength on the battlefield. He had seen the brute force of Jax, the cunning of Oliver, the noble defense of Hector. But this was a courage he had never witnessed. This was the courage of absolute, unconditional fatherly love, a courage that defied armies, logic, and death itself. King Preston finally spoke, his voice shattered by 12 days of weeping, but clear and dignified. "Godlike Achilles," the old king began. "Look at me, and in me, think of your own father. Think of King Marcus." Achilles flinched, as if struck. "We are both old men," Preston continued, the tears streaming down his face. "But your father, King Marcus, he is a lucky man, even in his worry. He knows you are alive. He sits in his palace, hoping against hope that one day, he will see you sail home from this terrible war. He has that hope to live for." The king's voice broke. "My hope is gone. I was the proudest of fathers. I had 50 sons. But the greatest of them, the one who defended our walls, the branch that held our whole house up, you killed him as he fought for his country. And now I have come here, in the dead of night, to suffer what no other mortal man on earth has ever endured. I have come to kneel before my enemy, and to kiss the hands that murdered my child." Preston gestured to the gold visible in the wagon just outside the tent. "I bring you a ransom beyond counting. I do not ask for justice. I ask only for mercy. Fear the gods, Achilles. Pity me. Think of your own father, and give me back my son." That was the word that broke the demigod. "Father." Preston's plea had bypassed the warrior completely and struck the son. Achilles saw the old king weeping for Hector, and in that instant, all he could see was his own father, King Marcus, weeping for him. He saw the father he had abandoned for glory, the father he now knew, with absolute certainty, he would never ever see again. The prophecy of his own death, which he had accepted in rage, now returned to him as a profound human tragedy. The dam of his rage, which all the violence in the world could not break, was suddenly shattered by a father's grief. Achilles began to weep. He wept for Patrick, his friend, whose death had started this horrific cycle. And he wept for his father, whom he had left alone. King Preston, seeing the warrior's tears, let his own grief flood forward, wailing for Hector. In that tent, surrounded by weapons of war, the two greatest enemies of the Trojan conflict sat and wept together. The killer and the king, united not in hatred, but in the shared, crushing, human cost of the war. Finally, Achilles stood. His rage was gone. The sickness that had poisoned him for weeks was purged. He felt only a vast, cold sadness and a profound respect. He gently took the old king by the arm and lifted him from the floor. "You are a brave man, King Preston," Achilles said, his voice soft. "You have a heart of iron. No other man would have dared this journey." He nodded to the outside. "Your son will be returned to you." Achilles accepted the ransom. But he would not simply hand over the defiled corpse. He ordered his men to take the body of Hector to a separate tent, hidden from the king's view. He worried that if Preston saw the raw, though magically preserved damage from the dragging, the old king might cry out in renewed horror, and Achilles feared that his own fragile newfound peace might snap, plunging them both back into madness. He called his female attendants, including Brianna, the woman their feud had begun over. He ordered them to wash Hector's body, to anoint it with sacred oils, and to dress it in the finest priceless robes that Preston himself had brought in the cart. They did this, treating the hero of Troy like their own fallen king. They brought the body back, now clean, peaceful, and wrapped for a royal burial, and placed it gently on Preston's wagon. Achilles then did the unthinkable. He shared food with the king. He insisted the old man eat. "Even the gods eat," he said. "We must have strength to bear our grief." When the meal was done, Achilles placed his hand on the old king's arm. "Tell me," he said, "how much time do you need? For the funeral rites of a prince, a man like Hector, you will need time. I give you my word. For as long as you need, I will personally hold the entire allied army back. There will be no war while you mourn your son." Preston looked at him, stunned by the grace. "If you would grant us this," the king said, "we would need 11 days. 9 days for the city to mourn. On the 10th day, we must burn his pyre. And on the 11th, we must build his tomb." Achilles nodded, sealing the pact. "So be it. For 11 days, the war will stop. My spear rests." As the very first light of dawn touched the sky, the divine herald, Mercury, reappeared, invisible to all but Preston. He woke the king's attendant and guided the old man and his precious cargo, the body of his heroic son, safely back through the sleeping camp, past the sleeping sentries, and across the plain. The gates of Troy opened in the dawn, letting out a wail as they saw their king return, not with a treaty, but with their dead hero. Achilles stood at the entrance of his camp, watching the cart disappear toward the city. His rage was finally over. The great story of his wrath was finished. All that remained now was the final, inescapable line of the prophecy. Achilles kept his word. For 11 days, the plain between the city and the camp was silent. There was no war. From the Allied beach, Achilles and his men watched the smoke rise from Troy. It was the funeral pyre of Hector. King Preston had kept his word, building the tomb for his son. The truce was honored. The story of Achilles' rage was finally, truly over. On the morning of the 12th day, the war began again. Achilles returned to the battlefield, but he was a changed man. The blinding volcanic rage that had driven him to desecrate Hector's body was gone, cleansed by the meeting with King Preston. Now, all that remained was a cold, hollow certainty. His vengeance for Patrick was complete. His feud with King Mason was irrelevant. He was now simply a soldier, fighting to fulfill the second half of his prophecy. He had achieved his eternal glory. Now, he was just waiting for his early death. The Allied army, led by the newly returned Achilles, expected a swift victory. With Hector gone, Troy's spirit should have been broken. They charged the gates, expecting the Trojans to surrender. They were wrong. The gates opened, and a new army poured out. During the 11-day truce, reinforcements had arrived. This was an army the likes of which the Allies had never seen. They were the Amazons, a legion of ferocious warrior women from the far reaches of the world, and they were led by their magnificent and terrifying leader, Queen Zara. Queen Zara was a warrior equal to any man. She rode at the head of her cavalry, and her army hit the Allied line like a hurricane, fighting with a disciplined fury that shocked the veteran soldiers. The Trojans, their morale restored by this new hope, rallied behind them. The battle raged. Queen Zara herself seemed untouchable. She cut through the Allied champions, her spear ablur, seeking the greatest glory. And she knew that meant finding the man in the glowing armor. She sought Achilles. They met in the center of the battlefield, a clash of titans. Zara was perhaps the fastest fighter Achilles had ever faced, her movements fluid and deadly. She threw her javelin, which Achilles deflected with his divine shield. She attacked with her sword, raining blows upon him, but she could not pierce the god-forged armor. For a moment, Achilles felt something he had not felt in years, the joy of pure combat against an equal. But he was stronger, and he was invincible. He parried her final attack, knocked her shield wide, and saw his opening. He drove his heavy spear forward with all his strength. The spear pierced her shield, punched through her bronze breastplate, and mortally wounded her. Queen Zara collapsed from her horse, falling to the dust. The Amazon army, seeing their queen fall, let out a wail and began to fall back. Achilles approached the fallen champion, as was his right, to claim the armor as his prize. He stood over her, and he removed her helmet. And he froze. Beneath the blood-stained helmet was not the face of a savage, but the face of the most beautiful, noble, and brave woman he had ever seen. She was young, her eyes wide, gasping her final breath. In that instant, Achilles, the man who had been dead inside since Patrick's fall, the man who had turned his heart to iron, felt something shatter. He recognized her spirit. He saw the bravery that matched his own. And in that tragic, impossible moment, he fell completely in love with the enemy queen he had just murdered. He dropped his spear. He fell to his knees beside her body, his mind reeling from the cruelty of fate. He had just killed the one person who might have understood him. He gently touched her face, consumed by a new, tragic grief, completely different from the rage he felt for Patrick. The Allied soldiers began to gather around, watching their great champion weep over the enemy he had just slain. Most were silent, awed by the strange scene. But one man was not. His name was Theron. He was an ugly man, not just in appearance, but in spirit, a bitter, cynical soldier known for mocking his superiors and poisoning morale. He saw the demigod weeping, and he saw his chance to tear him down. "Well, look at him!" Theron shouted, his voice grating. "Our great champion! He's crying like a girl for the woman he just skewered. He must have fallen in love with her. Too bad you had to kill her to get her helmet, Achilles. Now you'll just have to settle for the corpse." The soldiers around him gasped. The insult was profound. Theron was mocking the purity of Achilles' grief, twisting this tragic moment into something vile, just as he had mocked Achilles' love for Patrick months before. Achilles' head snapped up. His eyes, which had been filled with sorrow, went cold. The old, dormant rage flashed. This was the voice of the world that did not understand honor, the voice that spat on love and sacrifice. Before Agent Oliver or Jax could intervene, Achilles stood. He took one step toward Theron. He did not draw his sword. He simply swung his open hand. It was a simple, backhanded slap. But it was the slap of a demigod. The force struck Theron in the head, shattering his jaw and snapping his neck instantly. The cynic dropped to the ground, killed in a single heartbeat, dead before he even realized his mistake. A horrified silence fell over the army. The soldiers recoiled. They had understood, even forgiven, his rage against Hector, the enemy who had killed his best friend. But this was different. He had just murdered one of his own soldiers, an allied man, in cold blood, simply for a vulgar insult. The allied army stared at him, not with awe, but with fear. They realized in that moment that Achilles was not just their champion. He was an unstable, divine weapon, a force of nature that could turn on them at any moment. Achilles stood alone, utterly isolated, between the corpse of the queen he had tragically loved and the corpse of the soldier he had just murdered. His glory was complete. His revenge was finished. And now, his humanity was gone. He was just an engine of death, waiting for the prophecy to finally claim him. Achilles stood in the silence of his own making, a circle of fear isolating him from the very army he championed. The body of Queen Zara, whom he had loved and killed in the same heartbeat, lay near the corpse of Theron, the soldier his divine strength had erased for a vulgar joke. The allies now looked at him not as a hero, but as a catastrophic force of nature, a loaded weapon with no safety. Achilles did not care. He was alone, hollowed out by grief, and simply waiting for the prophecy to deliver its final check. The Allied command, led by King Mason and Agent Oliver, knew this was the moment. Hector was dead. Queen Zara and the Amazons were broken. Troy's spirit was gone. They called a final council and ordered an all-out assault, a single massive push to end the 10-year war. Achilles did not wait for the orders. He picked up his spear. He knew his destiny was tied to this last charge. He went to the front of the line, and when the trumpet sounded, he led the attack. The entire allied army surged against the city. The Trojans fought back with the desperate courage of doomed men, defending their homes and families. The fighting at the walls was the most brutal the war had ever seen. Achilles, however, was an unstoppable spearhead. He was a glowing comet of vengeance, his god-forged armor deflecting everything the Trojans threw at him. He reached the main gate of the city, the Scaean Gate, the very spot where Patrick had been tricked, where Hector had died, and where his own fate was waiting. He was a whirlwind of death. He broke the Trojan defenders, shattering their shield wall. He was about to physically break the gate itself and become the first man inside, ending the war single-handedly. High on the ramparts, watching this unstoppable monster tear down the last of his city's defenses, stood Perry. Prince Perry. The man whose selfish act of stealing Helen had started this entire, catastrophic war. Perry was no warrior. He was a lover, a coward, and an archer. He watched the glowing demigod slaughtering his brothers below, and in a fit of pure, blind panic, he drew his bow. He didn't aim with skill. He didn't pick a target. He just fired a random arrow down into the chaos, hoping for a miracle. The arrow tumbled uselessly, doomed to miss. But the city of Troy had one defender left. The divine protector, the sun god who had defended the walls against Patrick, the god who had guided the fate of this battle. This deity saw the desperate, random arrow. And he saw the arrogant warrior about to destroy his sacred city. The god decided in that instant that the prophecy must be fulfilled. The unseen divine hand seized the arrow in mid-flight. It steadied the shaft, infused it with supernatural speed, and guided it. The god steered the arrow away from the divine shield, past the helmet, past the impenetrable breastplate. It guided the arrow down, 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 toward the only part of Achilles the gods knew was mortal. The arrow struck Achilles deep in his left heel. It was the single spot on his entire body that had remained human. The very flesh his mother, Tethys, had gripped when she submerged him in the supernatural river Styx. The magic had protected everything the water touched. It could not protect the spot her desperate, loving hand had shielded. The invincible warrior froze. The sound of the battle went mute in his ears. He had been hit by spears, by swords, by rocks. He had ignored them all. But this was different. This was not a wound to his divine flesh. This was pain. Real, agonizing, human pain. He looked down, confused, at the simple wooden shaft sticking out of his ankle. Achilles let out a roar, but this time it was not the roar of a lion. It was the shocked cry of a dying bull. He staggered, dropping his shield. He ripped the arrow out of his heel, but the damage was done. His invincibility was not just pierced, it was broken. The magic was shattered. He was, for the first time in his life, completely mortal. He fell to one knee. The Trojan defenders, who had been fleeing in pure terror, stopped. They looked back. They saw the impossible. The glowing demon, the butcher of Troy, was on his knee. He was wounded. He was vulnerable. A new sound erupted from the Trojan throats. Not a wail of despair, but a roar of sudden, desperate hope. He is down. The god is down. Forgetting their fear, the Trojans surged back out of the gate. They no longer cared about the allied army. Their eyes, filled with 10 years of hatred, were fixed on one prize, the body of Achilles and the divine armor he wore. The allies, seeing their champion fall, cried out in their own panic. The mighty warrior Jax, screaming in rage, raised his massive shield and charged forward to stand over the fallen hero, to protect the body. Agent Oliver rallied the troops. A desperate, swirling vortex of combat erupted at the gate, the most brutal fight of the entire war, a battle not for the city, but for the dying body of the greatest warrior the world had ever known. The battlefield erupted into a vortex of pure chaos centered on the fallen Achilles. The Trojans, energized by the impossible, surged forward, desperate to seize the god-forged armor and desecrate the body of the man who had butchered their hero. But Achilles, even in death, was the greatest warrior on the field. He was mortally wounded, his lifeblood pouring from the fatal wound in his heel, his invincibility gone. But as the first Trojans reached him, he rose to one knee. Propped up by his divine shield, the dying lion used his final breaths to defend himself, his spear lashing out, killing the men who tried to claim him. It was not enough. His strength faded. He collapsed, finally, into the dust by the Scaean gate. The Trojans roared, rushing the body. But they were met by a wall. The mighty warrior Jax, who had fought Hector to a standstill, saw his champion, his rival, fall. Roaring with a grief that matched Achilles' own rage, Jax planted himself directly over the body. His massive shield took the brunt of the spears, and his heavy sword swung in wide, terrifying arcs, creating a circle of death that the Trojans could not penetrate. He was an immovable object, a fortress of loyalty, daring the entire Trojan army to take the hero from him. Agent Oliver saw the maneuver. He knew Jax was the greatest defensive fighter alive, but even he could not hold off an entire army alone. Oliver, the master strategist, did not join the brawl. He organized the troops around Jax, forming a disciplined wedge, a phalanx of spears aimed outward. Jax! Oliver screamed over the battle. We have him! Fall back! Now! While Oliver and the tactical squad pushed the Trojans back, creating a pocket of safety, Jax swung his club one last time, then reached down. With a grunt that shook the ground, he lifted the massive dead weight of Achilles, armor and all, and threw the fallen hero over his own giant shoulders. Shielded by Oliver's strategic rearguard action, Jax, carrying the weight of a god, ran. They made it back inside the allied trench. The hero was recovered. But the war, for Achilles, was over. The prophecy was fulfilled. The greatest warrior of his generation was dead, killed by the coward who started the war, in the very spot his dying enemy had foretold. When the news hit the camp, the army broke. Their symbol of invincibility, the man who could not be harmed, was gone. Far away, his mother, the sea goddess Tethys, felt his life extinguish. She and her sea nymph sisters rose from the ocean, their divine wail of grief chilling the hearts of every sailor on the sea. The allies held a funeral that eclipsed even the one they held for Patrick. They built a pyre that burned for days, a column of smoke that signaled the end of an era. When the fire finally died, they followed the final wishes of their hero. They gathered the ashes of Achilles and, taking the golden urn that held the ashes of Patrick, they mixed them together. The two friends, the warrior and his heart, were finally, truly, united for eternity. The army mourned. But the war was not over. Troy was celebrating the death of their tormentor, but the city walls still stood. With Achilles gone, a new, critical question arose, posed by High King Mason. What was to be done with the armor? The divine, god-forged armor that Tethys had brought from the master craftsman. This was not just a suit of metal, it was the ultimate prize, the symbol that its wearer was now the greatest surviving hero in the Allied army. Two men, and only two, had a legitimate claim. The first was Jax, the giant, the unbreakable wall, the cousin of Achilles, a man of pure strength and traditional honor, who had physically stood over the body, fought off the Trojan army single-handedly, and carried the hero home on his back. By the rights of strength and valor, the armor was his. The second was Oliver, the clever agent, the master of strategy. He had not carried the body, but he had orchestrated the rescue. His tactics had saved not only Jax, but the entire retreating force. Furthermore, it was his strategy, they argued, that would ultimately win the war, not brute force. King Mason, seeing the dangerous rivalry brewing, declared that the armor could not simply be given away. A council would be held. The captured Trojan princes would serve as judges, and the two heroes would make their cases. Jax and Oliver would plead for the armor, and the judges would award it, not to the strongest, but to the most deserving, the man who had done the most for the army. Jax, a man of simple honor, was furious. He knew his deeds spoke for themselves. He had saved the body. Oliver had merely talked. But Oliver, the master of rhetoric, the man who could talk his way out of any trap, smiled. The battle would not be fought with spears. It would be fought with words. And in that arena, Oliver was as invincible as Achilles had ever been. The ashes of Achilles and Patrick were sealed in their golden urn, but the war remained. The army was now leaderless, their invincible champion gone, their spirit broken. To restore morale, High King Mason had to name a successor, and the symbol of that succession was the armor, the god-forged glowing armor that Achilles had worn in his final, glorious rampage. An assembly of the greatest surviving kings and commanders was called. The two contenders, the only men with a true claim, stood before them. The armor itself was placed on a stand between them. The mighty warrior Jax spoke first. He was not a man of politics. His words were blunt, heavy, and angry. He pointed to his massive shield, which was dented and scarred from 10 years of war. "My deeds speak for me," Jax roared, his voice booming across the silent camp. "When Achilles sat in his tent, who went out to fight Hector? I did. When Patrick fell, who stood over his body? I did. And when Achilles himself fell, who became the wall that held back the entire Trojan army? Who physically carried that divine armor, and the hero inside it, back to this camp on these shoulders?" He struck his massive chest. "This armor was forged for the greatest warrior. I am the greatest warrior left. It belongs to me. Are we giving our highest honor to a man of strength, or to a man of whispers?" He glared at Agent Oliver, who stood calmly, waiting his turn. Oliver then stepped forward. He did not shout. His voice was calm, reasonable, and deadly persuasive. "Jax is a great man. He is a wall. He is the strongest arm in our army. We honor him. But a wall does not win a war. A mind wins a war. An arm does not swing itself. It must be guided by a brain." He looked at the council. "Jax tells you he saved the body. This is true. But who saved him while he did it? Who organized the tactical retreat that allowed him to escape? Who was the ambassador sent to Achilles when all hope was lost? And who," Oliver paused, letting the point land, "was the man who found Achilles in the first place, when he was hidden on Skyros, disguised as a girl? Without my mind," Oliver concluded, "Achilles never would have fought at Troy at all. Jax is the army's body. I am its brain. You are not awarding the past, you are awarding the future. Give the armor to the man who can actually figure out how to take this city." The debate was over. The kings deliberated. The argument was heated, but Oliver's logic was inescapable. The war had stalled on brute force for 10 years. It would only be won by cunning. King Mason stood and delivered the verdict. The divine armor of Achilles was awarded to Agent Oliver. Oliver accepted the prize humbly. The camp was silent. Jax did not move. He stood frozen, his face draining of all color. This was not just a lost contest. This was the ultimate public statement. The entire army had just declared his life's work, his strength, his honor, his courage, his blood, as secondary to the tricks and whispers of a spy. His honor was shattered. His entire identity was erased. He said nothing. He did not curse. He did not threaten. He simply turned his back on the council, his head held high, and walked out of the assembly, disappearing into the twilight. That night, a madness took him. The humiliation and grief were too much for his mind to bear. The shame was a poison, twisting his thoughts. He became convinced that Oliver, King Mason, and the other leaders had conspired against him, that this was the ultimate betrayal. He vowed in his rage that they would die for it. He grabbed his sword, his eyes burning with a desperate fury, and stormed toward the command tents, intending to slaughter every leader who had insulted him. But a divine delirium, a tragic fate, clouded his vision. In the darkness, he mistook his target. He did not go to the command tents, he stumbled into the army's livestock pens. In his profound madness, he saw the harmless sheep and oxen as the kings who had wronged him. He saw a large, horned ram and believed it was Oliver. He saw a great bull and believed it was King Mason. 4 hours, Jax rampaged under the moon. He screamed insults. He called them cowards, thieves, and traitors. And he slaughtered the helpless animals, convinced he was exacting his revenge, his sword flashing, until the entire pen was silent, awash in blood. The sun rose. The cold morning light hit the beach. The divine madness receded, leaving only the man, standing exhausted, his sword dripping, in a field of butchered livestock. Jax looked at his hands, coated in gore. He looked at the dead sheep at his feet. He realized what he had done. He had set out to kill the kings in a fit of righteous honor. Instead, he had been reduced to a butcher of farm animals. The shame was absolute. He had lost the contest. He had lost his mind. And now, he had made himself a laughingstock. He could not go back. He could not face the soldiers. He, the second greatest warrior in the world, the wall of the allies, was ruined. He walked away from the camp, down to the empty beach. He took his massive sword, the very sword Hector had given him years ago as a prize of respect after their duel, and he planted the hilt firmly in the wet sand, aiming the razor-sharp point toward his own chest. The allied army, still reeling from the funeral of Achilles, awoke that morning to a new horror. Their greatest defensive champion, the mighty Jax, was dead, having fallen on his own sword, a victim not of the Trojans, but of his own shattered pride. The allied camp was now a place of profound despair. They had held funerals for their two greatest champions in the span of a single week. Achilles, their god, was dead. Jax, their wall, was dead by his own hand, a victim of politics and pride. The army was broken, leaderless, and staring at the unbreakable walls of Troy, convinced the 10-year war had all been for nothing. King Mason called an emergency council. They were at rock bottom. Their strength was gone. Their spirit was shattered. What do we do? Mason demanded of the prophet, the army's chief oracle. Achilles is gone. Jax is gone. How can this war possibly be won? The prophet, his eyes clouded by visions, spoke. You misunderstood the prophecy. It never said Achilles would take the city. It only said you could not win without him. His sacrifice and the death of Hector fulfilled that fate. But the walls of Troy were built by the gods. They will never fall to brute strength alone. The city itself is magically protected. Achilles and Jax are dead because they were the symbols of strength. Now, fate demands a new path. It demands cunning. The prophet laid out 3 new conditions. The war could not be won unless 3 artifacts were brought to the battle. The first, and most critical, was the invincible bow of Hercules. A chill went through the council. Every commander there knew who had that bow, and they knew the crime they had committed to lose him. The bow belonged to a commander named Philip. A brilliant archer, Philip had inherited the legendary weapon from the great hero Hercules himself, a massive bow whose arrows were dipped in the venom of the Hydra, a poison so potent it caused unhealable wounds and agonizing death. 10 years ago, when the fleet first sailed for Troy, Philip had been with them. But on the journey, they stopped at an island to sacrifice, and Philip was bitten by a venomous serpent. The wound was horrific. It did not heal. It festered, oozing poison, and the smell was so foul the army could not eat. Worse, Philip would scream, day and night, in unending, agonizing pain. He was useless as a soldier and destroyed the army's morale. So the commanders, led by King Mason and on the specific, practical advice of Agent Oliver, made a ruthless decision. They waited until Philip fell into an exhausted sleep, and they sailed away, abandoning him on that deserted island, which they called Exile Island. They had left him to die, alone, 10 years ago. Now the prophet told them, you cannot win without the man, and the bow, that you betrayed. Every eye in the tent turned to the man now wearing the divine armor of Achilles. Agent Oliver. This was why he had won the armor. Not because he was strong, but because he was the only man alive who could possibly fix this. This required a silver tongue, nerves of steel, and the ability to confront the worst parts of his own past. Oliver's mission was set. He must sail to Exile Island, find the man he left for dead, and convince this justifiably hateful, wounded hermit to forgive the entire army, rejoin the war, and save them all. Oliver took a small, fast ship and sailed to the desolate island. It was a place of rocks, thorny bushes, and the smell of sickness. As he walked inland, he heard it. Not a voice, but a sound that chilled his blood, a guttural, animalistic scream of pure, unending, 10-year-old pain. Oliver followed the sound to a damp, dark cave near the center of the island. The smell was overwhelming. And there he was. This was not the prince he remembered. This was a feral creature, a hermit broken by agony and loneliness. His hair was matted, his clothes were rags, and his leg was a mass of infected, ruined flesh. He survived only by shooting seabirds with the few arrows he had. The creature looked up, his eyes wild. He saw the shimmering, God-forged armor. He saw the face of the man standing in the cave mouth. His wild eyes widened, first in total disbelief, and then, in a flare of pure, concentrated, white-hot hatred. He remembered that face. It was the face that had condemned him. You, Philip hissed, his voice like rocks scraping together. He scrambled, ignoring the fire in his leg, grabbing the massive, dark wood weapon that leaned against the cave wall. It was the bow of Hercules. Philip notched a black-tipped, poisoned arrow, drew the massive bowstring back, and aimed it directly at Oliver's heart. Philip stood trembling in the mouth of his cave, the massive, dark wood bow of Hercules drawn taut, its poisoned arrow aimed directly at the heart of Agent Oliver. 10 years of agony, isolation, and betrayal stared down that arrow shaft. Oliver stood perfectly still, his life hanging on the whim of the man he had personally condemned. He did not reach for a weapon. He was wearing the divine armor of Achilles, but he knew that armor meant nothing against the Hydra's poison. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm and clear over the sound of the wind. "Kill me, Philip," Oliver said. "You have earned that right 10,000 times over. I will not stop you. But know this, if you do, our entire army fails. Troy wins. Everything we sacrificed, and more importantly, everything you have suffered for 10 agonizing years, will mean nothing." Philip snarled, the bowstring straining. "The gods do not make men suffer without reason," Oliver continued, taking a careful step closer. "The prophet has spoken. The gods have declared that the walls of Troy cannot fall without that bow in your hands. Your wound, your pain, your exile, it was all leading to this moment. We betrayed you. This army betrayed you. Avenge yourself. Do not let the men who abandoned you fail. Come back with us. Our healers are blessed by the gods. They can cure your wound. Come back, Philip, and let your arrow be the one that ends the suffering of 10,000 men and punishes the city that caused all this." The appeal worked. Philip's hatred for Oliver was immense, but his desire to see Troy fall, and his desperation for his pain to finally end, was greater. He slowly, agonizingly, lowered the bow. "Heal the wound," he growled, "and I will have my vengeance." They brought the feral, broken warrior back to the Allied camp. The soldiers, seeing what their decision 10 years ago had done to him, were overcome with shame. The army's chief surgeons, men said to be descended from the god of medicine, were brought in. They worked for a day and a night, cleansing the festering, snake-bitten wound. And then, a miracle occurred. The poison was purged. The flesh began to mend. The 10-year fire in his nerves went out. Philip stood up, for the first time in a decade, without pain. The army had its champion. Philip, healed and restored, took his divine bow to the front lines. He watched the ramparts, his eyes scanning for his target. He did not have to wait long. Prince Perry, the man who had stolen Helen, the man who had started the war, and the man whose cowardly arrow had killed Achilles, stood on the wall, mocking the allies. Philip smiled. He calmly notched an arrow dipped in the Hydra's poison. He drew the great bow. He did not aim for the heart or the head. He aimed for the hand that stole the queen and drew the bowstring that killed the hero. The arrow flew, perfect and silent. It struck Perry directly. The Trojan prince screamed. It was only a small wound in his hand, but the unhealable poison began its work instantly. The venom of the Hydra does not kill quickly, it mirrors the suffering Philip had endured. Perry was taken from the walls, his body convulsing, dying in unimaginable, agonizing torment. Poetic justice had been served. The man who began the war was dead. The Allied camp erupted in cheers. Perry was dead. Philip was their hero. But the next day, the cheering stopped. The walls of Troy still stood. The gates remained barred. Killing Perry had brought justice, but it had not brought victory. King Mason, frustrated, summoned the prophet again. "We have the bow. Perry is dead. Why does the city stand?" The prophet shook his head. "You have fulfilled the first condition, but two remain. The city is still magically protected. You have the vengeance of Hercules, but you still need the blood, and you must steal the luck." "The blood?" Mason asked. "The gods demand that the blood of Achilles must finish this war," the prophet declared. "Achilles is dead, but his son lives." Oliver felt a cold dread. He knew this. Years ago in Chapter 2, when he had traveled to the island of Skyros to find Achilles, who was hiding disguised as the maiden Pyrrha, he learned that the prince had not been idle. Achilles had a secret love affair with the king's daughter, and had fathered a child. That child, named Neo, was now a hard, angry teenager, a prince who despised the entire allied army. He hated them for luring his legendary father away to a war from which he never returned. "And the luck?" Oliver asked. "Troy cannot fall," the prophet said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because deep inside the city's highest temple, locked in the most secure citadel on earth, sits the luck of Troy. It is a sacred, divine statue, a gift from the gods. As long as that statue remains within Troy's walls, the city itself is invincible. The walls cannot burn, and the gates cannot be breached. The task, once again, seemed impossible. The army was stuck. They now had to solve two problems. They had to sail back to Skyros and convince the angry, abandoned son of Achilles to join the war of the men who let his father die. And they had to somehow get inside an unbreakable city, infiltrate a guarded temple, and steal its most sacred, magically protected artifact. The army turned as one, to the only man alive who could possibly do both. Agent Oliver, the man in Achilles' armor. The Allied camp was energized by the return of Philip and the righteous, poisoned death of Prince Perry. But victory celebrations were short-lived. The walls of Troy remained, and the prophet's words hung over them. They still needed the blood, and they still needed the luck. The burden of fulfilling these impossible prophecies fell squarely on the shoulders of the one man alive who could do it, Agent Oliver. His first mission was diplomacy. He had to recruit the heir. Oliver sailed back to the island of Skyros, to the court of King Coleman, the same place he had visited years ago to fetch Achilles. But this time, he was not looking for the father, he was looking for the son. He found Prince Neo, the child Achilles had fathered during his time hiding as a maiden. Neo was nothing like the golden, charismatic Prince Achilles had been. This was a young man forged in shadow. He was dark, brooding, ruthless, and filled with a profound resentment for the army that had lured his legendary father to a war that had stolen him, and a war that had finally killed him. When Oliver arrived, clad in the divine armor he had won, Neo sneered. "So you are the man," Neo said, his voice cold. "The strategist. The man who wears my father's armor, an armor you did not win in battle, an armor you won in a talking contest after the real heroes were dead." Oliver endured the searing insult. He knew the boy was half right. "I am the man your father trusted," Oliver replied, bending the truth. "And I am the man who tells you that your father died the greatest hero the world will ever know. But the war he gave his life for is stalled. His sacrifice will mean nothing unless we finish it. The gods have declared that only the blood of Achilles can sack the city. That blood is you." Oliver stepped closer to the angry young prince. "We are offering you your birthright. Stop hiding in your father's shadow. Come with us. Take his place. Fulfill the prophecy your father started. Come and claim the eternal glory that belongs to the house of Achilles." The appeal to glory worked. Neo, desperate to prove himself equal to the legend he had never met, and possessing a ruthless streak his father had lacked, agreed. The blood of Achilles was now theirs. Oliver returned to the camp with a young, fierce prince. The army now had Philip, the bowman, and Neo, the heir. But the final condition remained. Troy was still magically invincible. They had to steal the luck. This was not a mission for an army. It was not a mission for a warrior. It was a mission for a spy. Oliver handed the divine armor of Achilles to Neo, a symbolic passing of the torch from the father's friend to the father's son. For himself, Oliver prepared a different costume. He dressed in the filthy rags of a beggar. He broke his own nose and covered his face in dirt and grime, transforming himself into another broken refugee of the war, a man invisible and beneath notice. Under the cover of darkness, Oliver crept across the plain. He did not go to the gates, but to the section of the wall where the refugees and slaves gathered. The Trojan guards, seeing just another wretched old man begging for scraps, beat him for his trouble and then shoved him through the checkpoint into the starving city. He was inside. He moved through the dark alleys, listening. He needed to find the high temple, the citadel. As he lurked in the shadows, a figure, veiled and regal, cornered him, flanked by guards. It was Queen Helen, the face that had started the war. She looked closer, and her eyes widened. She recognized those cunning, intelligent eyes. "Oliver," she whispered. The guards moved to seize him, but she stopped them. Helen was exhausted. After 10 years with Perry dead, she was no longer a prize. She was a prisoner, hated by the Trojans. She wanted this nightmare to end. She wanted to go home. "They keep it in the high temple of the citadel," she whispered quickly, betraying her new masters. "No one is allowed near it. They say it protects the walls. Go. End this." She turned and vanished back into the palace. Oliver used the intel. He moved to the inner citadel, the highest point of the city. He scaled the sheer, unguarded rock face, moving like a shadow. He reached the temple. He encountered the priests who guarded the relic. They were not warriors. Oliver, the master strategist, was also a lethal killer when necessary. He eliminated them silently, without raising an alarm. He entered the inner sanctum. There it was. Not a grand statue, but a small, ancient, wooden idol, humming with a strange, palpable power. This was the luck of Troy, the divine artifact that made the city invincible. Oliver wrapped the statue in his rags, climbed back down the citadel wall, slipped back into the refugee camps, and, just before the sun rose, escaped the city. He returned to the Allied camp, bruised and filthy, but triumphant. He stood before King Mason and the Allied command. He presented Prince Neo, the Blood. He held aloft the sacred statue, the Luck. Philip, the Bow, stood beside him. All the prophecies were fulfilled. All the magical conditions for victory had been met. Troy was no longer divinely protected. It was just a city with 30-foot stone walls, bronze gates, and thousands of desperate soldiers still ready to fight. The Allies had cleared the path, but they were still locked outside. The 10-year stalemate continued, until Oliver looked at the massive stacks of wood used to build their ships and repair their siege engines, and a new idea, the greatest and most desperate gamble in the history of warfare, began to form in his mind. The army had its tools. Oliver stood before King Mason, the mission complete. In the Allied camp now stood Philip, the divine archer who had executed the man who started the war. Beside him stood Prince Neo, the ruthless young son of Achilles, representing the Blood. And in Oliver's hands was the Luck of Troy, the sacred statue, stolen from the city's heart. Troy was no longer magical. It was no longer divinely protected. For the first time in 10 years, it was just a city of stone, wood, and men. But those walls were still high, and those men were still desperate. King Mason ordered another full-scale assault, led by the fierce new prince, Neo. The attack was brutal, but it failed. The walls held. The Allied army, exhausted and demoralized, realized that even without magic, Troy was unbreakable by force. They had fulfilled the prophecies, and they were still locked out. In the command tent, facing total failure, Agent Oliver unveiled his final, greatest, and most dangerous idea. "We have tried strength for 10 years, he told the council. "It cost us Achilles. It cost us Jax. We cannot force our way through that wall without sacrificing the rest of our army. We have tried strength. We have tried magic. Now, we must use psychology. We cannot break down their gate. So, we must make them open it for us. We must make them invite us in." The commanders stared, confused. Oliver laid out the master plan. "We will build a monument," he said. "A massive horse, hollow, built of wood, dedicated as a sacrificial offering to the gods of the sea, to grant us a safe voyage home." He continued, "The entire Allied fleet, every ship, will burn this camp to the ground. We will pack, and we will sail away. We will make them believe we have given up. We will vanish, seeming to accept defeat." Neo, the son of Achilles, slammed his fist on the table. "This is a coward's trick. We fight until the walls fall." "Your father's strength did not take the city," Oliver said, his voice silencing the prince. "My mind did. My way secured the bow, your presence, and the luck. My way will end this. We will hide the fleet just around the bend, behind Eagle Island, just out of sight. And the Trojans, believing they have won, will come out." "And what of the horse?" King Mason asked. "That," Oliver smiled, "is our key. Inside the hollow belly of that horse, our deadliest, quietest soldiers will be hidden. And the Trojans, believing the horse is a gift, a symbol of their victory, they will pull their own doom inside their city." The plan was insane. It relied entirely on the enemy behaving exactly as predicted. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale. But it was the only plan they had left. They agreed. They tasked Evan, the army's master engineer, with the construction. Using the fir planks from their ships and the wood from sacred groves, Evan and his team built a wonder. A horse, as tall as a 3-story building, magnificent, terrifying, and perfectly hollow. Oliver then picked his team. This was a mission only for the best. He would lead. Neo, the blood of Achilles, would provide the lethal force. King Miles, the man whose wife had been stolen, demanded to be there to reclaim his own honor. Philip, the archer, joined them, along with 24 other elite, silent commandos. One final, critical piece remained. They needed a volunteer for a suicide mission. They needed one man to stay behind, to be captured by the Trojans, and to sell the lie. A soldier named Simon, the bravest spy in Oliver's unit, stepped forward. His job was to endure any torture and convince King Preston that the horse was a sacred offering. The day came. The elite team climbed a rope ladder, one by one, sealing themselves inside the dark, cramped, suffocating belly of the wooden monster. They were entombed, armed only with their swords and their discipline. Then, the rest of the army executed the grand deception. Just before dawn, the Allied army set fire to everything. They burned their tents, their supplies, their siege engines. Their entire 10-year-old camp was torched, sending a massive column of black smoke into the sky, a signal of total departure. The entire fleet, thousands of ships, raised their sails, caught the wind, and sailed west, heading for home. They vanished over the horizon. Simon, the spy, was left tied on the beach, as if he were a forgotten sacrifice. The sun rose. The sentries on the walls of Troy rubbed their eyes. They squinted. They shouted the alarm. The entire starving population of the city rushed to the ramparts. They stared out at the beach, expecting another day of battle. Instead, there was silence. The Allied ships were gone. The entire fleet had vanished. The Allied camp, their home for a decade, was nothing but smoking ruins. The beach was empty. The war was over. The siege was broken. They had won. Weeping, cheering, screaming in disbelief, the Trojans stared down at the empty plain, where only one object remained, sitting silently in the sand just beyond the ashes of the camp, a single, colossal, magnificent, and utterly mysterious wooden horse. The sun rose over Troy, and for the first time in 10 years, the Trojans woke not to the sound of battle, but to silence. They rushed to the ramparts and stared, weeping with joy. The impossible had happened. The beaches were empty. The 1,000-ship fleet was gone. The Allied camp, their prison for a decade, was a field of smoking ash. The war was over. They had won. A cry of celebration went up, and the great gates of Troy, sealed for a decade, were thrown open. The entire population, starving and victorious, poured onto the empty plain. And then they saw it. Sitting alone, where the Allied command tent used to be, was the horse. It was a colossus, as tall as their own citadel, a magnificent, terrifying wooden beast. The city erupted in debate. What was it? It is a trick, some shouted. Burn it! Push it into the sea! The city's prophetess, Cassandra, ran through the crowd, her eyes wide with terror, screaming, "It is doom! It is a trap! It is filled with death!" But the gods had cursed her long ago. She would always speak the absolute truth, and no one would ever believe her. They pushed her aside, calling her mad. Others argued it was a trophy. They left it for us. The ultimate sign of their defeat. Then, soldiers dragged a figure before King Preston. It was Simon, the Allied spy, bound in ropes, appearing terrified. "We found him left behind." Simon, a master actor, wept and begged for his life. He told them the lie he and Oliver had perfected. "I am a deserter," he cried. "The cruel agent Oliver hated me. He tried to sacrifice me to the gods for a safe journey home, but I escaped in the darkness. The fleet is gone." Simon continued, "This horse is their offering to the sea god. Our prophet told them they had to build it this impossibly huge size specifically so that you, the Trojans, could never drag it inside your mighty walls. The prophecy said that if you destroy this horse, the sea god will destroy Troy. But, if you can bring it inside your city, the divine protection of the gods will transfer to you, and Troy will rule the world forever." Just then, a Trojan priest named Father Landon, a man loyal to the old gods, shouted that Simon was lying. "This is a trick. I fear the allies, especially when they bear gifts." To prove the horse was a fraud, Father Landon hurled his heavy ceremonial spear. It struck the wooden belly of the beast with a loud, reverberating, and distinctly hollow sound. Inside, in the pitch blackness, the commandos froze. Neo gripped his sword, but Oliver put a firm hand on his chest. Silence. The crowd gasped at Father Landon's sacrilege. And then, the ocean itself seemed to answer. The sea began to boil. 2 colossal, terrifying sea serpents rose from the waves. The crowd screamed. The monsters surged onto the beach, ignoring the thousands of onlookers. They made straight for the one man who had defied the offering. They attacked Father Landon and his 2 young sons, crushing the life out of them before dragging their bodies back into the depths. The Trojans stared in absolute horror. The sign was undeniable. The gods had spoken. Simon was telling the truth. Father Landon had struck the holy offering, and he had been instantly, brutally punished. The horse was sacred. The debate was over. They had to have it. But the horse was too massive to fit through the Scaean gate. So the Trojans, in their final ultimate act of victorious pride, did the one thing the Allied army could never accomplish in 10 years. They brought ropes, and they tore down a massive section of their own unbreakable, God-built wall to make a path. All day, the city celebrated. They attached the horse to rollers and, with the entire population singing and cheering, they dragged their own doom into the very heart of their city. That night, Troy held the greatest celebration in its history. After a decade of siege and starvation, they feasted. They drank rivers of wine. They danced and sang hymns to their victory, right at the feet of their new, glorious trophy. Exhausted, victorious, and completely drunk, the entire city, one by one, fell into a deep, dark, and heavy sleep. Inside the horse, Oliver, Neo, King Miles, and the commandos had waited for hours in the suffocating, cramped darkness, listening to the party finally die down. At last, silence. Around 3 in the morning, Simon, the spy, now celebrated as a hero by the Trojans, crept through the dark, sleeping streets. He gave the signal, the soft call of an owl. Oliver unbolted the hidden trapdoor in the horse's belly. A rope dropped to the ground. One by one, the shadows, the elite killers, rappelled down into the heart of the sleeping city. They split into teams. Oliver and Neo took a team to the high citadel. They lit a massive beacon, a signal fire visible to the Allied fleet that was waiting, hidden in the dark, just behind Eagle Island. The fleet saw the light, and the oars of 1,000 ships began to pull, silently, back toward the shore. The other commando teams, led by King Miles, rushed the main gates from the inside. They slaughtered the sleeping, drunken Trojan guards, cut the massive ropes, and lifted the colossal bronze bars. With a groan that echoed through the sleeping city, the main gates of Troy swung wide open. Just as the Allied army, pouring from the ships, reached the broken wall, the sack of Troy had begun. The main gates of Troy, which had held back the greatest army in the world for 10 years, swung open with a groan. They were opened not by force, but by a trick. Waiting outside in the darkness was the entire Allied army, back from their fake retreat, their ships silent in the harbor. They poured into the sleeping, drunken, and defenseless city like a dark tide. The sack of Troy had begun. This was not a battle. It was an execution. This was the release of 10 years of pent-up rage, grief, and frustration. The soldiers, remembering Achilles, remembering Patrick, remembering the giant jacks, and remembering their decade lost on this foreign beach, showed zero mercy. They moved through the streets, setting fire to the beautiful homes, slaughtering everyone they found, sparing neither the elderly nor the young. The central fight took place at the royal palace. The last of the Trojan guards made a desperate stand, but they were cut down by the elite commandos who had emerged from the horse. Inside the burning palace, old King Preston, seeing his city and his family destroyed, tried feebly to put on his ancient, ceremonial armor. He knew his fate had come. He was found clinging to the main altar of his household, praying to the gods who had abandoned him. He was confronted not by King Mason, nor by Agent Oliver. He was confronted by Prince Neo, the son of Achilles, his eyes cold, his armor, borrowed from Oliver, the armor of his father, still clean. King Preston looked at the ruthless young man. "I met your father once," the old king pleaded. "In his tent. He was a man of honor. He showed mercy. He pitied my grief." Neo sneered. "My father was a fool to pity you. That pity, that moment of weakness, is why he is dead and why I am here. I am not my father. I am his vengeance." Ignoring the old king's plea for mercy at the sacred altar, Neo, the blood of Achilles, fulfilled the final prophecy. He raised his sword and killed the last king of Troy. The brutality did not end there. Neo, proving himself the most ruthless of the allied champions, hunted down the survivors of Hector's line. He found Hector's wife, Anna, clutching their small son. Arguing that the son of Hector must never be allowed to grow up and seek revenge, the child was taken from his mother's arms and thrown from the high walls of Troy. The royal line was extinguished. Queen Heather and the prophetess Cassandra were chained and taken as slaves. Across the burning city, King Miles, the man who had started the war, rampaged through the palace searching only for Helen. He found her. After 10 years of death caused by her betrayal, he raised his sword to finally execute her. But even in the smoke and fire, her divine beauty was staggering. He looked at the face that had cost the world so much, and his rage failed him. He lowered his sword, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her toward the ships. She was going home. By the time the sun rose, Troy was gone. The city that had stood for 1,000 years, the unbreakable city of prophecy, was a smoking, desolate ruin. The war was over. Agent Oliver, his face grim, stood on the shattered ramparts where Hector had once stood, watching the fire consume the last vestiges of the city. His armor, the armor of Achilles, was splattered with the ash of the city he had conquered. He had won. Not with strength, but with his mind. The Allied fleet, loaded with treasure, gold, and slaves, finally sailed for home. They had their victory. But the story that survived the ages was not theirs. King Mason returned home to his own dark fate. Oliver would wander the seas for 10 more years, lost. The victory was bitter, and the cost was catastrophic. The story that endured belonged to the man who did not live to see the victory. Achilles had been given a choice, a long, quiet, forgotten life, or a short, bloody one that would grant him eternal glory. He chose glory. He was the greatest warrior the world had ever known, an invincible demigod. But his pride and his rage cost him the one person he loved, his friend Patrick, plunging him into a darkness that ended in the death of his rival, Hector, and the desecration of his body. His rage was finally healed, not by vengeance, but by the surprising humanity of a grieving father. And in the end, the Invincible Warrior was brought down by a coward's arrow, striking the one single fatal flaw left by his mother's desperate love. His story is a warning about uncontrollable rage and the emptiness of revenge. But his choice was fulfilled. The city of Troy is dust. The names of the kings are footnotes. But the name of Achilles, the Golden Prince, the Lion of the Allies, the Invincible Warrior with the fatal heel, achieved exactly what he was promised. His glory is, and will forever be, immortal.